Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was the Cleverest Hero? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Hisashi stared up at the illuminated billboard, wondering what the hell he was even doing here. Beside him, he knew Shoyuta was wondering the same thing. Neither of them had quirks particularly suited to rescue scenarios, and certainly wouldn't do any good to the 10 or so people currently shuffling about dazedly on the catwalk that ran just beneath the bottom of the billboard. All attempts to call them down had been fruitless. Clearly they were still under the effects of whatever quirk had possessed them to climb up there in the first place, and it was obvious they would need to be gotten down all at once or some of them might fall in the confusion. Hisashi knew he couldn't be of any help in that department, but as a hero it was his duty to help in any way he could. A few dozen yards away, behind the police line, a news crew was setting up, and Shoyuta was eyeing them with distaste. They had missed the better part of the attack, including the long chase down the dark but still moderately busy street in which the villain's quirk activation power had caused several people to lose control of their quirks, creating a great deal of chaos for the heroes to deal with before they could catch the perpetrator. The 10 victims still under the effect of one of those haywire quirks was the best spectacle they could hope for, and they weren't about to miss what was left of the story. Hisashi knew the hero Eraserhead would stay as long as it took to get the victims to safety, but he also knew his friend Shoyuta wouldn't like being on camera. "I could just scoop them up in my arms," argued Mount Lady, currently at her smaller size as she talked strategy with the 5 other heroes present, including Eraserhead and Present Mike. "Too risky," countered Kamui Woods, shaking his head. "You'd be lucky if you didn't knock any of them off. They're not exactly going to be working with you." He offered no alternative solution, and Hisashi privately thought he might have been stalling until the cameras were set up. "Maybe we should just get the police to set up an air pad," Shoyuta said, sounding rather convincingly bored and disaffected. It would have taken someone who knew him well to see how anxious he was to have this over with. Hisashi opened his mouth to second that idea, despite how long it would take, when suddenly a flash of movement at the police line drew his eye. He turned, just in time to see a young boy straightening from where he ducked under the police tape. He was short, with a mop of messy, curly green hair, and he wore a UA uniform and a look of intense determination. "Hey kid," called one of the cops, lunging for him, but the boy dodged nimbly between the policeman's arms and continued on toward the base of the billboard. All of the assembled heroes were busy arguing with one another, so none of them besides Hisashi noticed the kid march quickly up to the large electrical box at the base of the billboard, beside the covered ladder that gave access to the catwalk, and pull the enormous switch that controlled the main power supply. Abruptly, the bright lights that illuminated the billboard from below shut down with a loud noise of deep finality, leaving the catwalk in darkness. The attention of the rest of the heroes was caught at once, and one of them actually swore when he saw who had turned out the lights, but before any of them could move, the kid pulled out a flashlight, clicked it on, and shone the beam up the covered ladder. Hisashi looked up, following the beam of light, to see that it had become a bright spot in the midst of the crowd on the catwalk. The victims all crowded around it, looking down the hole, and then one of them knelt and began climbing down the ladder. The covering was only a wire cage, meant to prevent accidental falls, but it kept the victim soundly in place as he calmly climbed toward the ground. As soon as there was room, a woman knelt down and began climbing down as well, the clustered crowd seeming to patiently wait their turn to climb to safety. "Kid," called Shoyuta, beginning to move toward the boy, but Hisashi flung out a hand. When Shoyuta looked at him, Hisashi pointed up at the catwalk. "Well," said one of the others in surprise, possibly Kamui Woods. "Never would have thought of that," said someone else, but Hisashi wasn't paying much attention. The billboard was rooted in an alleyway between 2 shops along the commercial street, the base shrouded in shadow, so the kid's flashlight was the brightest point in the dark. As the victims began to get off the ladder, they clustered around the kid, bumping him as they jockeyed for position, trying to get close to the light. Once there were 3 of them down, the kid started having trouble keeping steady, as all of them were bigger than him, and he was obviously trying to make sure the light stayed in place. "Don't just stand there," Shoyuta suddenly barked, forcing his way past Hisashi's hand and making purposefully for the kid. Help the boy. The rest of the heroes immediately leaped into action, each of them taking a victim by the arm and leading them gently to the small cluster of ambulances that had gathered at the edge of the police line. There were 6 heroes and 10 victims, so 4 of them had to go back for more, but Hisashi and Shoyuta let the other heroes have the limelight as they melted into the background, eyes on the kid with the flashlight. As soon as all the victims were all safe, the kid clicked off his flashlight and looked around nervously, but could see no one looking at him. Quickly he began to creep back toward the police line, obviously intent on slipping away into the crowd, and he jumped and cried out when Shuta's hand came down on his shoulder. "Come with me," Shoyuta ordered sternly, and the kid gulped. Shoyuta and Hisashi towed the kid behind one of the ambulances, out of sight of the cameras and most of the onlooking crowd. The kid's eyes were darting left and right as though looking for an escape, but when Shoyuta let go of his arm he turned to face the 2 heroes with a sheepish expression. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice high and anxious. I couldn't let those people get hurt, and none of the heroes were doing anything, and I just had to make sure dash." "You're not in trouble," said Shoyuta firmly. The kid stopped rambling and blinked up at him, nonplussed. Hisashi didn't have to look at Shoyuta to see how hard his expression was. He was probably frightening the kid. "Hey!" Hisashi struck a pose, turning on all his present mic charm. "That was some rockin' quick thinking you displayed just now. How'd you know that would work?" Hisashi felt Shuta's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly at the appearance of his more flamboyant persona, but it had the desired effect. The kid relaxed, exhaling shakily, and smiled weakly up at the 2 heroes. I was there when those people got hit," he explained. "They thought they were moths, so they were drawn to the biggest source of light. That was the billboard, so I just shut off that light and gave them something else to be drawn to." Hisashi glanced at Shoyuta, who was giving the kid a contemplative look. "You go to UA," he said. It wasn't a question. The kid gulped again. "Yes, sir," he said, answering him anyway. "I know every kid in class 1A and 1B, Shoyuta informed him. This was true. He and Hisashi always made it a point to know all the hero students by sight, even though it was only the end of the first week of school. "You're not in the hero course. The support course maybe?" "No, sir," the kid shook his head. "I'm in 1C, the Gen Ed course. I just like to study quirks. It's a bit of a hobby." The kid slid his bright yellow backpack off his shoulders and opened it, tucking away the flashlight and pulling out a notebook. It was battered, and it looked almost burned in places, with what looked like water damage in others. On the cover was written, "Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, in black ink." Shoyuta took the notebook and began to flip through it. His expression didn't change, but Hisashi could tell he was quite interested. He also seemed content to leave the kid and Hisashi waiting while he read, so Hisashi cast around for something to say to keep the kid from panicking. His eyes were again drawn to the cover and back cover of the notebook. He was sure those were burn marks. "Seems like that notebook's seen better days," Hisashi said carefully. "You get into a lot of scrapes with this hobby of yours?" "Oh no," the kid shook his head vehemently, his dark green hair flopping back and forth. "I always stay behind the police line when I watch hero fights. I never get in the way. Well, except for that one time. But that's not how my notebook got messed up." "What happened then?" Hisashi asked, his smile firmly in place, trying to let the kid know he wasn't going to press the issue of that one time any further than the kid was willing to volunteer. The kid, however, cast his eyes down. "My friend Kaken kinda, used his quirk on it," he explained, sounding dejected. "I don't think he wanted to destroy it. He just, wanted to show off. Property damage doesn't exactly top the charts as the best way to show off your quirk," Hisashi pressed, keeping his tone light and upbeat, keeping his voice gentle. "Yeah, well," the kid shrugged, looking more defeated than before. "That was the same day he told me to jump off the roof, so I don't think he was really worried about property damage." Anger welled up inside Hisashi so fast he went breathless with it. He could feel his eyes narrowing, his lip curling in disgust, but the kid was still looking at the ground and didn't notice right away. He couldn't afford to let the kid see his expression, it would only frighten him more, but the mention of suicide baiting struck a chord with Hisashi in the way only true villainy tended to. "Mike," said Shoyuta, pulling Hisashi's attention abruptly onto him. "There's an entry for you in here." Hisashi blinked. "What?" Shoyuta turned the notebook around, displaying the page he'd been looking at. At the top of the page was written, "Present Mike," and halfway down the opposite page was a surprisingly detailed sketch of his speaker. His eyes flicked over the clean lines of kanji, and before he knew what he was doing he had taken the book from Shoyuta the better to read the analysis within. It was an incredibly sophisticated breakdown of his quirk and fighting style, noting both his strengths and his limitations. Scattered throughout the entry as well were questions, musing about the potential uses and applications of Hisashi's quirk, and whether or not he had ever considered incorporating specific moves into his fighting style. Hisashi was surprised to realize there were questions that not even he had considered. Could his quirk, potentially, do that? "I have another entry in an earlier notebook," the kid assured him as he read. "It's from a while ago though, so I decided to update it recently. I think the original Present Mike entry is way back in Journal 6. Hisashi opened his mouth to inquire how long the kid had been doing this, and how many heroes he'd practiced his analysis on, when a loud cry from the police line drew the kid's attention. Hisashi turned to look as well, to find another boy in a UA uniform, this one with purple hair sticking straight up and prominent bags under his eyes, bursting through a knot of policemen trying to hold him back. He stumbled a little, nearly falling over as his forward momentum carried him out of reach of their grasping fingers, but he quickly righted himself and sprinted the few yards to where Hisashi and Shoyuta stood talking to his schoolmate. "What dash?" Shoyuta began, looking at the newcomer, but was immediately silenced as the purple-haired kid bent stiffly at the waist, bowing in earnest respect to the two heroes. "Please," he shouted, probably louder than he'd mean to. "Please. Don't blame Mito for what I did." Hisashi and Shoyuta looked at each other, then back at the purple-haired kid. The kid whose notebook Hisashi was holding, Mito, if he had to hazard a guess, looked stricken, but said nothing. "What did you do?" Shoyuta asked, after a moment of silence. The purple-haired kid stiffened, but didn't rise from his bow. "It was my quirk who convinced those people they were moths," he admitted shakily. "I got hit by that villain's quirk and lost control. Thinking they were moths was the most harmless thing I could think of, and then I got separated in the crowd so they couldn't hear my voice and dash." "Please," said Mito, interrupting his classmate to bow equally low, "don't blame Shinchan. It was my idea that we should be out here so late, and then when the fight started I wanted to get closer and see. I dragged him into the path of that villain, so if anyone's to blame it was me." "Mito was only cleaning up my mess," Shinchan insisted. "Please don't be mad at him." "Shinchan's only here because of me," Mito countered. "Please dash." "That's enough," said Shoyuta harshly, his quirk causing his eyes to go red and his hair to stand on end. The two boys' heads snapped up, both of them obviously terrified, but almost immediately Shoyuta dropped his quirk. "Neither of you is in trouble." Both boys straightened, looking at each other in confusion. "Really?" asked Shinchan shakily. "You're not going to get us in trouble?" Hisashi struck a pose again. "Being caught in a villain attack isn't a crime," he said, as loudly and enthusiastically as he could without drawing attention to their conversation. "No one got hurt, so it's good vibes only." Both boys exhaled audible, their shoulders slumping in obvious relief. Shoyuta gave him a look, but didn't comment on his antics. Instead he looked back at Mito. "I just have one question," he said, making Mito tense again, and Shinchan look at him nervously. "If you two were both in the thick of it during the attack, why didn't your quirk go haywire too?" Mito suddenly looked ashamed, eyes on his shoes and mouth twisted into a wibbling line, his cheeks growing red under their scrutiny. Hisashi wanted to say something to put the boy at ease again, but he knew Shoyuta wouldn't appreciate it if he didn't get his answer first. I don't have a quirk," Mito said quietly. Hisashi barely caught himself before letting his mouth drop open. This boy studied quirks like a professional analyst, diffused what amounted to a hostage situation with a flashlight, ran toward danger rather than away from it if it meant he might learn something. And he did it with no quirk at all? Shoyuta took the notebook from Hisashi's slack fingers and handed it back to Mito. Be more careful next time, he instructed both boys, and when they nodded furiously he gestured back toward the police line. You're not in trouble, so get going. I'm sure your parents are worried about you. Neither boy needed telling twice. They turned and ran back toward the police tape, ducking under and immediately disappearing into the crowd. Shoyuta and Hisashi watched them go, Hisashi still in shock, Shoyuta with a contemplative expression. What's on your mind? Asked Hisashi, recovering himself after a few moments of silence. Shoyuta turned, his face reverting to its usual bored expression. Nothing, he said dismissively. Come on, those vultures should be clearing off soon and I don't want to get asked for an interview. I can't believe that happened. Izuku exclaimed, once they were clear of the crowd and headed back towards the train station. I can't believe we didn't get arrested. Shinso, passing a hand over his eyes in exhaustion. Not that, Izuku waved him off. I mean, I can't believe we just met Present Mike and Eraserhead. I know they teach at the school, but we met them. Trust you to be more interested in the heroes than the danger, Shinso said without heat. You could probably get attacked by a villain yourself and you'd still be more interested in who came to save you. Come on, Izuku wheedled. You're telling me you don't care at all that you met the Eraserhead? That you spoke to him even? Suddenly Shinso stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. That was my first conversation with Eraserhead, he said, staring into space in horror. Yep, said Izuku brightly. I spoke to him for the first time ever, Shinso continued. You sure did. Izuku confirmed. And I was a colossal tool, Shinso said, slapping a hand over his face in mortification. I was apologizing for putting people in danger. I was so nervous I barely even remember what he said to me. Izuku's enthusiasm faded a bit, knowing what Shinso had to be feeling right now. He had admired Eraserhead since elementary school and been determined to get into the UA Hero course after finding out that he taught there. With his plans to get into the Hero course via the sports festival, Izuku knew that he had planned out his first conversation with his would-be teacher carefully. To know that his first impression had been unfavorable had to be devastating. However, Izuku also knew what would cheer him up. Well, I remember what he didn't say, he said, less brightly but with a gentle nudge to Shinso's shoulder with his own. What? Shinso asked glumly. He didn't say you had a villain's quirk, Izuku reminded him. Shinso looked up, his eyes full of realization, surprise and just a touch of wonder. No, he said slowly. He didn't, did he? Izuku gave a little snort of laughter, then took off again towards home, his best friend trailing behind him. I guess we really did get away with it, Hitoshi said, once he and Midoriya were safely at the back of the room. Midoriya nodded, letting out a little sigh of relief and slumping in his chair. They had snuck into class on Monday quiet as church mice, careful not to draw attention to themselves, but their homeroom teacher had given them a pointed look to show that he had not missed them. Fear had shot through Hitoshi's heart at the sight, but then their teacher looked away, allowing them to pass by his desk without comment. And here I thought the most we'd be doing to invite trouble was using the gyms meant for the hero students, Hitoshi said as he began to unpack his bag. There's no rule that says we can't use them, Midoriya insisted, struggling with the rusty zipper on his own bag. They're for everyone. Just like there's no rule that says someone without a physical quirk can't apply to the hero course, Hitoshi grumbled. Just because it's not supposed to matter doesn't mean it won't. There's always the possibility a student from another class will get in through the sports festival, Midoriya reminded him, finally getting the zipper to cooperate. It's good drama for the press if that happens, so they don't do anything to discourage it. Besides, no one said anything about us training in there for the first week, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. Hitoshi opened his mouth to point out that it still wasn't a good idea to go pushing their luck by getting involved in highly public hero actions, when suddenly his blood turned to ice as the loud, boisterous voice of Present Mike came from the front of the room. Hey, what's happening, teach? He nearly shouted, addressing their homeroom teacher. Mind if I borrow Midoriya for a minute before class? Hitoshi and Midoriya looked at each other, and Hitoshi couldn't help but think Midoriya looked as nervous and Hitoshi felt. Present Mike and Eraserhead had assured them they weren't in trouble for what had happened last week, but what else could a teacher from the hero course want to talk to either of them about? Midoriya, called their teacher, as though the entire room didn't know perfectly well who Mike was here for. Mike struck a pose pointing 2 finger guns at Midoriya. Do me a favor and bring your bag, will ya? Midoriya swallowed and stood up with his bag, looking like he was off the gallows, and followed Present Mike out of the room. Hitoshi let out a deep, nervous sigh. He hoped that whatever was going on, it at least wouldn't result in his first real friend getting expelled. Izuku tried his best to keep his breathing even as he stood out in the hallway facing Present Mike. His fingers were clutched tight around his yellow backpack, holding it between them like a shield. He should have known. He hadn't even lasted 2 weeks at UA. Kaken was right, he was always right, No need to be nervous, lil listener. Mike shouted, snapping Izuku out of his thoughts. You're not in trouble, I just want to chat about that notebook of yours. Oh, Izuku said softly in surprise, then cleared his throat and nodded. I see. I promise, I really am very careful when I'm working on it. I don't get too close, I stay behind the police line and observe. I'm sure a smart listener like you knows better than to get underfoot, Mike assured him, smiling wide and reassuring. I was pretty impressed with your analysis of my quirk though, that's some superstar insight you got going on. I've been experimenting with some of your suggestions, and I think I might be on the verge of a new special move that'll be a real chart topper. Izuku stared at him. His cheeks were heating up, and he knew his face must be red. Extraordinary pleasure was radiating from his chest, seeming to fill all his limbs with warmth. His analyses had always been for his own benefit, and more recently for Shinso's. They were just a way to understand how heroes operated better. The idea that they might be of interest to the heroes he was analyzing had never occurred to him. Thank you, Izuku stuttered. Glad I could help, I guess. No probs, lil listener. Mike gave him finger guns again. In fact, I was wondering if that notebook had any entries for other heroes at my agency. Oh, Izuku said, more a startled exhalation of nerves than anything. Yeah, I've got entries for all the heroes that work in this area. I mean, I've analyzed lots of heroes from around the country, but I get better information if I can watch the fights firsthand. He dug into his bag and pulled out his battered notebook. It felt almost shameful to give the raggedy thing to an actual pro hero, but Mike took it carefully, holding it as though it were something important. He opened it eagerly, flipping through the pages with obvious interest, and Izuku felt suddenly anxious again. Would he like what he saw in the other entries? Would he see whatever merit he saw in his own entry in the rest of Izuku's work? What would he think of Izuku as a result of? Mike closed the book suddenly, snapping Izuku out of his musings. He looked up at Mike nervously, wondering what to expect, but Mike didn't look unhappy. In fact, he looked downright pleased. Mind if I borrow this? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. Sure, Izuku said on a reflex, still reeling from how this conversation had gone. I guess I was almost done with that one anyway, so I should be getting a new one soon. Keep it as long as you like. Rockin', Mike said, once again full of enthusiasm, and Izuku couldn't help but smile a little bit. Now head on back to class, don't want you to miss a beat. Yes, sir. Izuku said, slinging his backpack onto his shoulder and skirting around Mike to get back to the door of Class 1C. Shinso gave him a wide-eyed look as he slid into his seat, but class began immediately after and there was no opportunity to tell him what had happened. All through their first few classes Izuku was itching to explain, and as soon as the bell rang for lunch Shinso was at his side, looking down at him expectantly as he gathered his things. He wanted to borrow my notebook, Izuku said, before Shinso could even ask. To show the other heroes at his agency. For real? Shinso looked shocked for a moment, then grinned. I guess someone else finally realized. No one knows more about heroes than you. Even the heroes themselves. Don't make fun of me, Izuku pouted as he led the way out into the hall. They stopped talking once they were out in the crowd, as neither of them particularly wanted to shout, but once they had their food and were outside under what had quickly become their usual tree, Shinso fixed his grin back in place and Izuku frowned. Shinchan, he whined. Please don't make it into a big deal. They're probably passing it around laughing at my fanboy ramblings anyway. I don't know about that, Shinso said around a mouthful of rice, but they might just be getting an ego boost out of it. I'm sure they all love knowing someone loves their perfect quirks as much as they do. Izuku gave a sad little smile and a nod of acknowledgement, then started in on his own food. He knew that Shinso hadn't had any easier of a time in middle school than he had, and it had left him bitter at people who had stronger quirks. Izuku knew that was something he'd have to deal with constructively if he'd make it in the hero course, but he also knew how nice it was to have a friend to talk about that kind of thing with. Even just letting it out to a willing ear could be therapeutic. Still, Shinso continued after a few bites, it'd be cool if they actually acknowledged all your hard work. The notes you've made have already improved my training and I bet they'll really pay off in the long run. Izuku couldn't help but smile at that. Yeah, he said excitedly. We'll train as hard as we can, and we'll construct you a fighting style that will really take advantage of your quirk. It'll have to be close range, so you can deal with more immediate threats physically while you catch farther away threats with your quirk. You'll need to have really tight control of your movements, so that you don't accidentally hit someone you've already caught and end up losing control of them when they feel the pain. If you could get some kind of capture weapon like Eraserhead, that would be ideal. Shinsu's laughter broke through his thoughts, making Izuku realize he'd been muttering. He ducked his head, feeling his cheeks heating up, but Shinsu's smile was genuine, without any hint of mocking. You might be the best thing that's happened to me yet, Mito, he laughed. You're the one with the cool quirk, Izuku pointed out, before taking a bite of his fish. And you're the one who was already training before we met, Shinso countered, gesturing at Izuku with his chopsticks. It barely even occurred to me to train my body when my quirk was what I wanted to show off, but you already knew more about improving different skills than me. I just wanted to learn to not be so helpless all the time, Izuku admitted quietly. You're not helpless, Shinso said easily, and Izuku felt a little thrill of pride shoot through him at the idea that there was at least someone who didn't see him as weak. If anything, you're terrifying. Weren't even afraid of my quirk when I told you how it worked, which means you've officially got more stones than anyone I've ever met. There's no reason to be scared of your quirk, Izuku said immediately. A quirk isn't inherently good or bad, and you can control it just fine, so no one has any excuse to be scared of you because of it. Shinsu's answering smile was shaky, and he looked away almost immediately. Izuku knew he wasn't used to hearing that he wasn't scary any more than Izuku was used to hearing he wasn't defenseless. It made Izuku all the more determined to say it over and over until Shinso believed it. I'll get a fresh notebook, Izuku assured him, and the first entry will be Shin-chan, future hero. As soon as we can find someone who will let us do tests on them, I'll do lots of experiments, and we'll find out exactly what you can do. You'll be a great hero someday. I promise. Shinso grinned again, wide and genuine, and then after a moment he began to laugh. Izuku joined in, and it seemed for a moment like anything that might come of the borrowed notebook was 1,000 miles away. It was about 3 days before anything did come of the notebook, and by the time it did, Izuku had almost forgotten about it. He was again sitting at the back of the room with Shinso, chatting about training as they waited for class to start, when their homeroom teacher's voice rang out across the classroom. Midoriya, he called for the second time that week, and Izuku looked up curiously to find Sir Night-Eye standing straight-backed and stoic at the front of the room. Izuku blinked uncomprehendingly for a moment, wondering what on earth Sir Night-Eye, a former sidekick of All Might, could possibly want with him. Then Shinso nudged him slightly with his elbow, and Izuku startled and leaped out of his chair like it was on fire. It wouldn't do to keep such an important hero waiting, no matter what his reason for being here was. Yes, sir? Izuku said questioningly as he reached the teacher's desk, looking back and forth between his teacher and Sir Night-Eye. Would you mind stepping out with me for a moment? Night-Eye said, all business. I won't keep you past the start of your lesson. Izuku nodded, and when Night-Eye turned and went out into the hall, he followed. Night-Eye closed the door behind them, leaving the two of them alone in the hallway, and suddenly Izuku wished fervently for his bag to hold between them again. Night-Eye didn't say anything for a moment, looking Izuku up and down appraisingly. Izuku did his best not to fidget under the scrutiny. What can I help you with, sir? He asked, more to avoid standing there like a gormless idiot than anything. Night Eye looked at him for a moment longer, then reached into his jacket and pulled out Izuku's ratty notebook. "You can tell me who taught you to do this," he said, his tone giving nothing away. Izuku blinked, not sure he understood the question. "Take notes." Night Eye gave a sharp little exhalation that might charitably be called a laugh. He waved the notebook in front of Izuku's face, making the pages rustle. "The analysis in this notebook is very advanced," he said, and Izuku gasped, feeling the same pleasure he'd felt when Present Mike praised his work shoot through him. "Are you telling me you developed this kind of technique on your own?" "Yes, sir," Izuku said, equal parts baffled and happy. "It's just a hobby I've had since I was a little kid. It's nothing special." Night Eye looked down his nose at Izuku, and a little bit of unease creeped into his stomach. Still, the high of having his work talked about in such a way was still with him, making his heart feel full and light. He met Night Eye's gaze steadily, waiting for his final appraisal. At last Night Eye held the notebook out to Izuku. "This has been passed around several different hero agencies," he said as Izuku took it from his hands. "Probably the whole thing's been photocopied by now. I noticed the number on the cover. You have more work like this?" Izuku's stomach dropped as he thought of Night Eye seeing his first hero analysis notebook, written in crayon while watching the news before his mother would trust him with pens on the table. He said nervously, "a bit? This stuff is the most recent, but I filled up notebooks faster as I got better. Probably Journal 7 is where you'd start seeing real analysis." Night Eye nodded his understanding, looking at the notebook contemplatively. Then he raised his eyes to Izuku's face, leveling him with a piercing look. "This is the kind of insight that keeps heroes alive," he said seriously. "You should think about transferring to the support course. Your skills are wasted in Gen Ed." "But," Izuku protested, trying to focus through the way his head was swimming with euphoria, "the support course is for people who build gear dash. It's for people who facilitate the work of heroes," Night Eye corrected. "A professional analyst falls under that heading. You wouldn't be the first and you won't be the last." "Would I get to work with the hero course students?" Izuku asked, his mind racing ahead to watching Shinso's training, to a hypothetical hero course student who might help with his experiments. "Probably," Night Eye replied, his tone suggesting something like amusement at Izuku's enthusiasm. "It would be the best way to hone your craft, and it would help them improve as well." Suddenly Izuku thought of Kaken, in the hero course now as opposed to when Shinso would enter later. He wouldn't like taking Izuku's notes on his performance. If anything, he was likely to react violently to anything like criticism. Izuku ran his fingers over the burn marks on his notebook. "As long as he doesn't burn it up this time," Izuku muttered, internally steeling himself against the anticipated attack. "Those burn marks," Night Eye said, causing Izuku to look up, not having even noticed he dropped his gaze to his hands. "A hero student made them." "Not here," Izuku said dismissively. "Earlier. We went to the same middle school." Night Eye nodded, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said, then turned to go. "You should get back to Dash." "Wait." Izuku called quickly, then shuffled slightly when Night Eye turned back to him. "You really think I could do it?" Then Night Eye did something he hadn't done since they'd stepped out of the classroom. He smiled, just a twitch of his lips, a small uptick at the corners of his mouth, but it made his face look infinitely softer. "Any hero agency would be lucky to have you," he stated firmly, as though it were a plain fact, like there could be no refuting it. "Thank you," said Izuku unguardedly. Night Eye nodded in acknowledgement, then turned away again. "Get back to class, Midoriya." "Yes, sir," Izuku said, then slipped back into the classroom as Night Eye headed off toward the wing where the hero classes were held. Mirai generally considered himself someone with an eye for talent. True, he was also an excellent teacher, but it took dedicated students to make great heroes, and all of his interns had left him with bright futures ahead of them. He vetted all his staff personally, and while some might consider the qualifications he looked for superfluous, it had never failed to net him the best workers money could buy. He didn't look into the future of everyone he met, but as someone with more of an eye for things to come than most, he knew the signs of someone destined for success. "Midoriya," he thought as he knocked on the door of the teacher's lounge nearest the hero course classrooms, had the potential for greatness in him. The story of how present Mike had come across his notebook the first time had circulated along with the item itself, and Mirai knew that someone who could do a thing like that had a sharp, quick mind and the ability to think on their feet. The analysis only confirmed what he already knew, that Midoriya had a bright future in the hero industry, and he had already decided he was going to do everything he could to facilitate that future. "Eraser, Mike," he greeted as he entered the room, then shut the door behind himself. The two heroes in question had been standing by the coffee pot, but they turned to him curiously when he spoke. Eraser looked at Mirai over the rim of his mug as Mike poured himself a cup, then set the pot back down. "To what do we owe the honor?" Eraser said, not sounding like he much cared. Mirai adjusted his glasses. "I came here firstly to apologize," he said, earning himself a pair of puzzled looks. "Mike, you requested that when the other agencies were finished with Midoriya's notebook it should be returned to you so you could give it back to him. I circumvented you, and have just come from returning it to Midoriya myself." Mike pouted, but before he could say anything Eraser stepped in front of him, effectively cutting him off. "That isn't your only reason," he said, perfectly certain of this conclusion. Mirai nodded. "I also came to give you some information," he said. "I spoke briefly with Midoriya, and encouraged him to join the support class. However, when faced with the prospect of working with the hero classes, he seemed wary of one of your students." "Wary?" Mike repeated, pout forgotten in favor of open concern. "The burn marks on the notebook," Mirai said. "I take it you noticed them?" "We did," said Eraser, eyes narrowing. "Hold on now," Mike exclaimed before Mirai could elaborate. "Are you saying it was a UA hero student who left those marks?" "He confirmed it," Mirai informed them. "He said that he and this student attended the same middle school, but I take it they weren't friends." Eraser and Mike turned to each other. "Bakugo," they said in unison. Mirai looked from one to the other. "You already know about the student in question?" "Not until just now," Eraser said, turning back to Mirai. "When we met Midoriya, he called the person who burned his notebook, Kaken. There's only 2 students in the hero course whose quirk could leave marks like that. I'd have to double-check their middle school records to be sure, but one of them is named Katsuki." "Tell me," Mirai insisted, noting with detachment the distaste that had creeped into his tone, "what's your impression of this Bakugo?" "He's proud, overconfident, violent, and at times downright cruel," Eraser said without hesitation. "He also got in with a grand total of 0 rescue points, which is a huge red flag. If you don't mind my saying so," Mirai raised an eyebrow, "I think this is another huge red flag." "It's more than a red flag," Mike said, his usual loud persona lost beneath a look of deep anxiety. "It's real cause for concern." "I'll have to talk to Nezu about him," Eraser said, looking down at his coffee cup as he swirled the contents around. Then he looked up at Mirai. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Mirai nodded. "Of course," he said shortly, then turned and exited the lounge, leaving 2 troubled teachers behind him. "The support course, huh?" Shinso said, looking up at the light filtering down through the leaves of their lunchtime tree. Izuku nodded excitedly, his lunch laying untouched as he flipped through his volume 11 notebook. It was the one with the most recent observations and analysis of Eraserhead, and Izuku was eager to get feedback on it. Mike had cornered him after school yesterday, after Nitai's visit, to ask if he had any more analysis notebooks he was willing to share, and Izuku had agreed to bring in more tomorrow. Notebooks 7 through 10, as well as 12, were stacked neatly beside him, waiting for the opportunity to be handed off. "He really seems to think I could do it," Izuku told him, eyes flicking between lines as he looked for errors or places the analysis could be fine-tuned in a hurry. "Of course you could do it," Shinso said, somewhat muffled with his mouth full, then swallowed. "That wasn't the question." Izuku looked up, giving Shinso a puzzled look. "What's the question then?" "The question is whether or not that's what you want," Shinso said seriously. "You'd be working with that maniac, and if you did this professionally, don't think he's the only maniac you'd have to deal with. Your job would be telling heroes they're not good enough, and I'm not saying you don't have the courage for it, but it's something to consider." Izuku considered this for a moment, letting his eyes fall back to his notebook. He'd managed to go a whole week and a half without crying in front of Shinso, and he didn't want to break that streak now. Still, he felt tears prickling in his eyes, and he blinked rapidly to avoid having to wipe them away. "I can't be a hero," he said at last. "It's not in the stars for me. But I always wanted to be useful to someone in some way, and if this is a way I can do that, I can't turn it down. I just don't want to be Deku anymore." Shinso was quiet for a moment, letting Izuku dash at his eyes with his sleeve without comment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, and it made Izuku look up at the gentleness of it. "I think you can do anything you put your mind to, Mito," he said quietly. "If this is what you think will make you happy, then I'm all for it. You deserve that much." "Thanks," Izuku said, his eyes feeling watery again as he looked at his best friend. "Hey Gen Ed boys," came a loud, feminine voice from somewhere behind Izuku. He whirled around to see a girl with salmon pink hair and wide, intense eyes, a pair of goggles perched atop her head. Instead of a uniform, she wore a pair of baggy pants and a black tank top with a jacket tied around her waist, looking for all the world like she'd just come from a machine shop. She was carrying a lunch tray balanced on one hand and waving animatedly with the other as she approached the two of them, a grin threatening to split her face in half. Izuku and Shinso looked at each other, eyes wide and confused. Shinso raised an eyebrow, darting his eyes to the newcomer and then back to Izuku. Izuku shook his head. He had no idea who she was. "Hi," Izuku said as she reached the spot where the two of them sat in the grass and flopped down, apparently uncaring of the way it made her dishes rattle. "Hiya," said the girl, grabbing her bowl of rice and fixing her piercing gaze on Izuku. "I'm Hatsume from the support course. You're Midoriya, right?" "Yes," Izuku asked, then cleared his throat when it came out sounding like a question. That's me. You're the one Sensei was talking about," Hatsume continued as she shoveled rice into her mouth. "You're going to transfer to the support course as an analyst." Izuku went red and sputtered for a moment, but before he could recover himself, Shinso laughed. "What do you know?" he said, elbowing Izuku. "You don't even have to ask about a transfer, they're already shoving you at the support course teachers." "Really?" Izuku finally managed, not sure what else he was supposed to say. "Yep," Hatsume said cheerfully. "I heard the teachers talking about it. Usually the analyst types go to the business course, so having one that wants to do support work is kind of a big deal." "It is?" Izuku flailed, nearly knocking over his water bottle as he tried to reorient himself. "I mean, it can't be that big of a deal, right? Market analysis and hero analysis are two totally different things. Surely there can't be that much overlap that the business course takes all the people like me." "Well, yeah," Hatsume shrugged, "but people who study things like quirks and fighting styles usually go into pro-heroics themselves, so we don't get a lot of them in the support course." "Oh," Izuku said, feeling suddenly dejected. Hatsume and Shinso were looking at him though, so he hitched a smile back in place and nodded. "Well, you don't have to worry about that with me. I don't have a quirk, so I'm not exactly hero material." "Excellent," Hatsume said excitedly, pumping a fist clutched around her chopsticks into the air. "You can tell me what kind of support gear is most needed in the industry. What kind of technology should I be focused on developing? What do heroes really need?" Izuku knew his mouth was slightly open, but he couldn't help it. He had just told a person who went to UA high school, that he didn't have a quirk and nothing bad had happened. She hadn't laughed at him, or grown suddenly cold, or attacked him outright. She still thought he was someone worth talking to, even without a quirk. He didn't need to be as strong as Kaken to be her friend. Just like that, the answer to her question rose nearly unbidden in his mind, and he answered her with almost equal enthusiasm. A section of the hero industry that could really use more support items is underground heroes, he explained as Hatsume listened with rapt attention. They tend to have less physical quirks, so they don't really need much to help control or take advantage of them. What they need is weapons that suit their environment and fighting style. They can't use the same kind of weapons that spotlight heroes use, because spotlight heroes need to be flashy, but underground heroes can't afford that. Take Eraserhead for example. He doesn't need much but a pair of goggles for using his quirk, but he based his entire fighting style around using his capture weapon. What they need are simple, efficient, versatile weapons that aren't designed to draw attention. Hatsume nodded, her eyes cast downwards as she thought. Simple, efficient, versatile, she repeated. Then suddenly she raised her eyes back to Izuku's face, giving him an almost maniacal grin. I can do that, she exclaimed, then winked. I think you and I are going to be great friends. Before Izuku could respond to that, he suddenly felt a hand wrap around his upper arm, and he was tugged gently to lean toward Shinso. Hey, Shinso said grumpily. Mito's my friend, get your own. It's okay, Shin-chan, Izuku insisted, even as he saw Hatsume stick her tongue out at Shinso out of the corner of his eye. We'll still get to work together when you get into the hero course. Gotta let your old friend here make some new friends. Hatsume concurred. High school is a fresh start after all. Shinso and Izuku both blinked at her. We're not old friends, Shinso said. We met last week on the first day of school. Now it was Hatsume's turn to blink in confusion. You just met, she repeated. But you're so familiar with each other. Izuku felt himself blushing again. He glanced at Shinso, to find him smiling his slightly mean smile he'd used when they first met. Izuku quickly picked up his chopsticks and pretended to be interested in eating, but Shinso was setting his things aside. We aren't old friends, Shinso began, but someone Mito went to middle school with did get into the hero course. He's a real piece of work too. I walked in on him about to blow Mito sky high with his flashy explosion quirk. Mito still called him Kaken, though, so I said it was weird that he used such an affectionate name with someone who bullied him. He wasn't always like that, Izuku said into his lunch. Maybe not, Shinso poked at Izuku's cheek, but you gotta admit, trying to pass yourself off as an affectionate person was a pretty dumb move. So that's how he ended up calling you Shin-chan, Hatsume concluded, grinning shark-like at Izuku. Shinso gave a little huff of amusement. After that it was weird calling him Midoriya, so I went with Mito. Hatsume threw back her head and laughed, long and loud, full of genuine mirth. You guys are a riot, she said, wiping her eye with one finger. We're gonna have so much fun this year. Shinso gave a slightly creepy little giggle, and Izuku couldn't help but laugh himself. High school was nothing like he imagined. Even with Kaken still there, potentially lurking around any corner, it was much better than middle school. He thought if it meant he got to have friends like Shinso and Hatsume, he would gladly have dealt with Kaken every day for the rest of his life. Izuku handed off his hero analysis notebooks to present Mike at the end of the day. He was still a little bit nervous about some of the earlier work, but Mike went straight for notebook 7 and began flipping through it before Izuku had a chance to escape. Having not yet been dismissed, Izuku held his ground, but Mike had again said that his analysis was very insightful, and taken all of the offered notebooks to look through and potentially show around. The next day at lunch, Hatsume again joined him and Shinso, already with a few rough ideas drawn on bits of paper that didn't look like this was their intended purpose. She talked animatedly about potential inventions, or babies, as she called them, and Shinso looked interestedly at a couple. He had yet to start training with weapons, and finding a particular weapon to be his signature had always been the plan. Izuku offered his opinion on the ones Shinso was interested in, how well they would fit into the fighting style he would need to develop, and Hatsume promised to think more about how she could create the ones they had agreed on. They had all just settled into actually eating what was left of their lunch, rather than nibbling on it as they worked, when a shadow fell across their little gathering. It came from behind Izuku, so he was able to see the stunned looks on Shinso and Hatsume's faces before he turned around. Kamui Woods. Izuku squeaked, looking wide-eyed up at the hero standing over him. Kamui Woods looked down at him. Midoriya, right? He said as Izuku hurried to turn himself around on the grass to look directly up at him. You got caught in the sludge villain incident, didn't you? Made a lot of trouble with that stunt you pulled. Yes, sir. Izuku looked away, but didn't lower his face. It would be too awkward to look down when the hero he was speaking to was so far above him. You're the one with the notebooks, aren't you? Kamui said. He did not sound particularly impressed. Izuku swallowed. Yes, sir, he repeated, wondering if this was the part where those notebooks finally got him into trouble. "I saw what you wrote about me," said Kamui. His expression was unreadable behind his wooden mask, but his tone wasn't exactly friendly. "You've got a lot to say about heroes who risk their lives for you every day." "I didn't mean anything by it," Izuku said hurriedly, shaking his head wildly back and forth. "Those notebooks were just supposed to be for me, just to help me understand heroes better, and then dash." "You got something to say about it?" came Shinso's voice, cutting off Izuku's rambled apologies. Izuku swiveled to look at Shinso, trying to make his eyes wide and pleading, but Shinso was looking up at Kamui with a look of bored distaste. "Most of the heroes who work here think Mito's analysis is pretty helpful," Shinso went on, even as Izuku began to shake his head slightly. "You think you're too good to take a little criticism?" Izuku turned slowly to look back up at Kamui. He knew his expression must be terrified. He felt like he was on the verge of tears, and he could barely bring himself to make eye contact with the hero. The sun was behind Kamui, shining in Izuku's eyes, but he wouldn't disrespect the hero by looking away. Then, quite unexpectedly, Kamui sighed. "Nah," he said, his posture relaxing into a somewhat easier stance. "Those analyses were exactly the kick in the pants some of my guys needed, and anything that gives me an edge is welcome." He shrugged nonchalantly, and Izuku could have sworn his soul left his body at the degree of relief that overcame him. "I do have a question for you though," Kamui continued when Izuku didn't respond. "You mentioned incorporating leaves into my fighting style, but I'm curious about how much you actually know what you're asking." "Huh." Izuku made a small exhalation of confusion, then drew breath and managed to ask, "What do you mean?" "I can grow leaves," Kamui informed him, extending one finger into an elongated twig and growing a single, bright green leaf to dangle from it. "However, I can't control them as precisely as branches, and they're far more delicate. I discarded the idea of using them in combat while I was in school." Izuku was veritably itching to get out his current notebook and start taking notes, but he clamped the instinct down. "They can still be useful though," he insisted, trying to sound like he was gushing rather than criticizing. "They can obscure your opponent's vision and limit their movements. A path blocked by branches is difficult to pass through, but a path blocked by branches and also obscured by leaves? You might as well put up a concrete wall." "They also make it difficult for me to see," Kamui countered, then lowered his voice and muttered, "and for the cameras to see me." Shinso coughed somewhere behind him, sounding like he was using the sound to hide a snort of laughter. A second later he grunted, and if Izuku had to hazard a guess he'd say Hatsume had poked him in the ribs. "Not necessarily," Izuku said, tactfully ignoring the second part of the hero's statement. "If you concentrate them specifically in the path of the villain and leave your other branches clear, you can get a good sense of where they are without them being able to see what you're doing. Plus, any leaves that fall to the ground are sure to become valued souvenirs." Kamui said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, his imagination clearly caught by the idea of his leaves becoming collector's items. Then he looked back at Izuku. "You talk a big game, little man, but how much do you really know what you're talking about? Have you ever been in a real fight? Besides the one All Might bailed you out of, I mean." Izuku swallowed, wondering which answer would be preferable. He quickly settled on the truth. "Yes, sir," he said, "I have, but it's never really much of a fight." Kamui looked at him for another moment, then said, "Spar with me." "Huh," said Izuku. "What?" said Hatsume. "No way," said Shinso. "No quirks," Kamui clarified, holding up both hands in supplication at Shinso's obvious ire. "Nothing serious, just a friendly little bout. Just to see how good your instincts are." Izuku's brain stalled, trying to think of a reason to refuse. He was sure whatever reason he gave Shinso and Hatsume would back him up, but nothing at all came to mind. "Sure." Kamui backed away several paces, and Izuku stood on shaky legs to take up position opposite him. He glanced only once at Shinso and Hatsume, who had adjusted themselves for a better view of the fight. Hatsume looked curious but worried, still eating but chewing slowly and thoughtfully. Shinso, on the other hand, had set aside his food, and he looked absolutely furious as he glared at Kamui. He did not seem to trust that the hero had only a friendly spar in mind. At least it won't be as bad as fighting Kaken, Izuku thought nervously, but that was all he had time for before Kamui attacked. Izuku blocked his first swing on instinct, a big right hook like Kaken's usual opener. The next swing came from the other hand and this time he ducked, bending his knees until he was level with the gap between the hero's legs. Immediately he dived forward, seeing an escape route as well as a way to put his opponent off balance, and he managed to make it through the opening before he was grabbed. He popped back to his feet, but instead of running away he turned, to see Kamui stumbling as he tried to right himself and whirl around at the same time. "Come on, short stack." Hatsume's voice reached his ears, but he didn't turn towards the sound. "Get him, Mito," came Shinso's at the same time. Deciding if he was going to do this he might as well do it, Izuku aimed a kick at Kamui's back, sending him lurching forward a few steps. Izuku went running after him, hoping to stay behind him for as long as possible, but before he could do anything else the hero was turning and moving out an arm towards him. For a second Izuku wondered what he was doing, as he was still too far away to land a hit, when suddenly branches exploded out from his forearm. In the space between 1 second and another, Izuku's mind raced through everything he knew about Kamui Woods. He'd watched 17 fights in which the hero had participated, including the ones he'd seen on YouTube or the news. He'd watched 22 villains fall before him. 3 villains, however, had gotten away. 2 of them, on 2 different days, had used one move. Page 57, Izuku thought, and jumped. He landed standing atop the thick, stable trunk with a wooden thump, and before he could destabilize and fall he channeled his wobbling into forward motion and went running down the branch toward Kamui. Kamui, for his part, had clearly not been expecting that, and when Izuku reached him he could do nothing but close his eyes against the kick Izuku aimed at his teeth. A painful jolt went through Izuku's toe as his worn sneaker connected with solid wood, and a moment later he was lifted off his feet, tangled hopelessly in the branches growing from the hero's other hand. Kamui stopped, steady on his feet once more but breathing hard as though in pain. Izuku wriggled a little, trying to free himself, but he was firmly caught and wouldn't be going anywhere until he was let go. The two of them looked at each other blankly, neither quite sure where to go from here. "Hey!" Shinso's voice drew Izuku's attention, and he turned to see his friend standing and making purposefully for the hero who had him pinned. "I thought you said no quirks? What do you call that?" "Sorry," said Kamui, beginning to extricate his twigs and branches from around Izuku. "Reflexes, you understand?" "Of course," Izuku assured him as he was deposited back on his feet. On the ground. "This kinda illustrates my point though, about using leaves to obscure your opponent's vision." "I suppose," Kamui said, still looking a little dazed. Shinso, who did not look at all like he understood about reflexes or intended to drop the subject of quirk use, opened his mouth to continue his earlier expressions of outrage. Before he could say anything, however, another voice rang out across the lawn. "What are you doing here?" Eraserhead demanded, marching toward them with an angry, determined stride. Kamui backed away from Izuku, hands held up at the level of his shoulders and making downward motions toward Eraser. "Take it easy," he said. "Can't a hero visit a hero school to chat with some students? We've already had one security breach this week. The perimeter was supposed to be tightened," Eraser said, crossing his arms over his chest as he came to stand before Kamui. "And those aren't hero students you're chatting with." "You could have fooled me," Kamui said, cracking his neck and throwing a wary glance at Izuku. "I asked if I could come talk to Midoriya and I have permission to be here." Eraser's eyes narrowed. What does a hero want with a Gen Ed student? "Kid's a hell of an analyst," Kamui explained, making Izuku glow with a now familiar pride. "He's got pretty good kinetic awareness too, and a fighter's instincts." At this revelation Eraser paused, giving Izuku a moment to process it himself. He'd thought about fighting, obviously. He's analyzed enough heroes' fighting styles to know what would work for a quirkless person and what wouldn't. All the training he'd done had been in a vacuum though, with no one who knew what they were talking about to tell him how well he was doing. Was it possible he'd advanced that much? Shinso, who had been looking between Eraser and Kamui as each of them spoke, was apparently content to stay quiet no longer. "He used his quirk on Mito," he accused seriously, after he said he wouldn't. "It's not that big a deal," Izuku insisted quickly. I was fine. Still not very heroic behavior, Hatsume piped up for the first time. You don't have a quirk, and you were unarmed. Kamui's head whipped around, abandoning his standoff with Eraser to stare at Hatsume. What do you mean he doesn't have a quirk? The hero sputtered. You considered him that much of a threat, huh? Eraser asked, but he didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded almost contemplative. Shinso looked about ready to explode with indignation, so Izuku took his friend by the arm. Shinso flinched but didn't pull away, still glaring at Kamui with fire in his eyes. Izuku, not sure what else to do, rubbed his hand over Shinso's back. Eventually Shinso looked at him, still glaring, but his face softened when he saw Izuku. Shinchan, Izuku said quietly. Shinso took a deep breath, then let it out in a great gust. Then he looked away, off to one side. Whatever, he said waspishly. Eraser gave a weary little sigh. The bell's about to ring for class, he said at last. Take your dishes inside. Yes, sir, Izuku said hurriedly, and began to drag Shinso over to his abandoned tray. The three of them collected their things and headed back inside. It was only once they were several paces away that Izuku heard Eraser and Kamui continue their conversation, but it was distant enough that he couldn't make out what they were saying. Hatsume shouted her goodbye over the crowd as she broke off from them to head to her own class, and Izuku and Shinso made their way back towards the Gen Ed wing. That was weird, Shinso said once they were safely back in their classroom. Definitely, Izuku agreed. Thank you, by the way. Shinso gave him a confused look. For what? For, Izuku fidgeted a little. Sticking up for me. Getting mad when you thought he was being unfair to me. Of course I was mad, Shinso said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. The guy came around just to make you uncomfortable and then tried to beat you up. You really showed him though. I don't think that was why he came, Izuku defended, even though Shinso's words made him feel warm inside, like being praised by the heroes did. He wondered what exactly that feeling was. And I didn't really show him much of anything. Except maybe why he should use leaves. Are you kidding? Shinso grinned. You were amazing. I didn't know you could even fight like that. We definitely need to add more sparring matches to our training. Izuku opened his mouth to argue, but the teacher cleared his throat pointedly to quiet the class, so he simply gave a nod of assent. More sparring would be a good idea. Night Eye had come to talk to Izuku on Wednesday, and Kamui Woods' visit was at Friday lunch, so by Friday afternoon Izuku thought he was justified in assuming he was done with excitement for the week. They had nearly run into Kaken on their way out of the building, but he was heading for one of the many gyms on campus, so Izuku merely towed Shinso in the opposite direction and they managed to escape Kaken's notice. The part of Izuku that still worried about these things told him Kaken was in a bad mood. He didn't know why that would be though, and it wasn't that different from Kaken's default mood, so he put it from his mind. They had to swipe their ID cards to get into the gym, on the opposite side of campus from the one Kaken was using, and as they entered a cheerful voice chirped out how many hours they'd logged working out. Izuku felt oddly pleased with how much time they'd spent training in only 2 weeks. They had agreed to use Izuku's strategic exercise regimen to train together on the first day of school, and even in this short amount of time they'd made real progress. He knew the hero students were probably doing more, given that they had class time to use, but he still felt like those logged hours were well spent. Thankfully there were only 2 other students there. Using the weight room for the moment, so Izuku and Shinso changed into their gym clothes and set up shop out on the main floor. Shinso wanted to spar right away, but Izuku insisted they do at least warm-ups first. They were just finishing that up, Shinso eyeing the practice mats hungrily, when a voice interrupted Izuku's concentration. Hey there listeners, called Present Mike, causing Izuku and Shinso to stumble to a stop where they'd been doing a few quick laps of the gym. They were very near the end of their 5th lap, and they had started by the door, so Mike was only a few paces in front of them. Izuku rested his hands on his knees for a moment. He was breathing hard, but beside him Shinso was breathing harder, and he recovered first. Hello sir, Izuku said, standing straight and smiling brightly at Mike. Working out always made him feel like smiling. What can we do for you? Midoriya, would you mind stepping out with me for a second? Mike asked, after striking a suitably dramatic pose. You're not in trouble and I'll let you get back to your workout in no time. Sure, Izuku said, glancing at Shinso to make sure it was all right with him. Shinso, who was still catching his breath, gave a thumbs up. Izuku followed Mike out of the main gym and into the front hallway between the door and the rest of the rooms. He expected Mike to lead him outside, but Mike seemed content with this level of privacy, and he stopped there and turned to look at Izuku. He was still smiling in what suddenly struck Izuku in a theatrical manner, and the way he placed his hands almost artfully on his hips, somehow coming out more casual than resolute, abruptly seemed studied. Is this about my notebooks? Izuku asked, not sure how to process that observation. Your notebooks have become an overnight hit, Mike said excitedly, but then some of his usual energy bled out of him as he gave Izuku a concerned look. I wanted to talk to you about that visitor you had today though. Kamui Woods? Izuku shook his head. That really wasn't a big deal. He had permission to be here, and he just wanted to talk about my analysis. He did a little more than talk, Mike pointed out, still a bit on the quiet side. I heard he challenged you to a sparring match. Yeah, well, Izuku shrugged, not really sure how to excuse his behavior. I didn't really know how to say no. And a hero like him should have considered that, Mike said. His tone sounded disapproving, but his eyes were soft as he looked at Izuku. I'm not sure I understand, Izuku admitted. Was I supposed to dash? You weren't supposed to do anything, Mike assured him. He was the one who should have considered the effect his authority would have on you. A hero needs to remember that they have influence over others with what they say and how they act. I see, said Izuku, though he did not see at all. Mike seemed to realize this, because he struck another dramatic pose and shouted, Take me for instance. I've got the ear of the younger audience with my radio show, so I'm careful to send good vibes only to my listeners. They look up to me because I'm a hero, so I've got to set a good example for them. Izuku couldn't help but smile at Mike's antics, even suppressing a little giggle. Mike relaxed his pose, grinning at Izuku, and looked at him over the rims of his sunglasses. I'm not surprised you got an in-person interview at all though, he informed Izuku proudly. You've done great work, and a lot of heroes are very impressed with your analyses. You're getting quite the reputation. Izuku shuffled from foot to foot, wondering if now was the right time to bring this up. Does that mean you think I should? Should I ask if I can transfer to the support course? For a moment Mike just looked at him. He was still smiling, his posture still studiously relaxed, but he seemed to be contemplating his answer carefully. Izuku braced himself, wondering how he'd deal with any answer Mike might give. Then suddenly Mike was back in full form, posing dramatically and giving Izuku double finger guns. I think you should shoot for the top of the charts, lil listener, he said boisterously. Whatever you think you can achieve, I say go for it. Izuku suddenly thought back to another conversation like this one, standing on a rooftop on the worst day of his life. Being told by All Might that his dream was unrealistic hadn't felt good. That was what had made him decide the Gen Ed course was the best he could hope for. Standing here now, with present Mike telling him to follow his dreams, that rooftop felt like a distant, unimportant nightmare. Thank you, Izuku said. It seemed woefully inadequate. Mick's smile widened, but it didn't seem theatrical this time. In fact, it might have been the most genuine smile he'd ever seen Mike wear. Anytime, Mike said, and Izuku couldn't help but smile back. Izuku spent the weekend wondering who he should talk to about the support course. It seemed insulting to ask his homeroom teacher about transferring out of his class. The hero teachers, despite their interest, probably had better things to do. Talking to the support course teacher, Power Loader, directly seemed the best course of action. Hatsume said he was tough, but fair, and had already been talking to other teachers about Izuku anyway. Izuku walked into class on Monday full of determination, ready to spend his free PRD tracking down Power Loader and asking what he would need to do to transfer, but no sooner had he reached his homeroom teacher's desk than a hall pass was being held out to him. Midoriya, you're to go see Principal Nezu before class, the teacher informed him, a knowing gleam in his eye. I doubt you'll be back before class starts, so take your things with you. Izuku took the pass with trembling fingers, then bowed his thanks with a little more formality than he normally would have. This probably wasn't the last time he'd see this teacher. He doubted the transfer would be immediate, but there seemed to be a certain degree of finality to the situation. His teacher nodded to him, smiling benevolently. Izuku only glanced at Shinso for a moment, receiving a sly, proud smile, and headed off for the principal's office. The door to Principal Nezu's office looked just like every other door in the school, which was to say rather larger than it needed to be. Izuku supposed there must be some students with quirks that made it difficult for them to fit, but it certainly gave the door a slightly ominous look. He swallowed, then raised his hand to knock, but before he could touch it the door swung open. "Midoriya," called Principal Nezu, beckoning him inside with one small paw, the other holding a cup of tea. "Principal Nezu," Izuku said politely as he came in and closed the door behind himself. He noticed that the seat opposite the hero was vacant, and there was a cup of tea already sitting out. "Please have a seat," Nezu gestured to the vacant chair. "Let's have a cup of tea, shall we?" Izuku took the offered seat, dropping his bag on the floor beside it, and obediently picked up the cup of tea. It was steaming but not too hot to touch, and when he took a sip he found that it seemed to be at the perfect temperature for drinking. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here," Nezu said, smiling at Izuku over the rim of his cup. Izuku decided to go for broke. "I assumed it was to discuss the possibility of my transferring to the support course," he said, hoping against hope that he didn't sound presumptuous. "You assume correctly," Nezu told him, then took a slow sip of his tea and sighed. "I've heard a lot about you, Izuku Midoriya. You've gained quite the reputation over the last week, and many pro heroes have recommended you to my attention. In fact, I've been hearing about you almost non-stop from several people I respect." Izuku felt his face grow warm, and not just from the tea. He fought the urge to apologize. "I seem to have gotten kinda popular," he said instead, then took a sip of his tea to avoid having to say anything else. "I've also had the pleasure of examining some of your work," Nezu continued. "It's very impressive. You have a highly analytical mind, and you seem to have honed your skills from early childhood. I would be fascinated to test your IQ, but perhaps another time." "Perhaps," Izuku agreed, idly wondering exactly how one tested one's IQ. "There is one thing I find somewhat curious though," Nezu told him. He did not immediately elaborate, opting to take another sip of tea and keep his piercing gaze fixed on Izuku. Izuku cleared his throat. "Oh," he asked. "Was there something about my analysis that was, illogical?" "No, there isn't," Nezu said, "and that in itself is what I find curious. You've put a lot of work into cultivating the skill, and it shows. You studied quirks and fighting styles, studied heroes, from a very young age." "Yes, sir," Izuku agreed, more than a little puzzled. "Despite this," Nezu went on, "you didn't even apply for the support course during the entrance exams. Indeed, it seems that UA's willingness to accept an analyst such as yourself into the support course is news to you." "I didn't really know much about the support course," Izuku admitted. "I thought it was just for people who built support items. But if there's something that I can do there, I'd like to do that kind of work." "So you spent years cultivating a skill for a position you didn't know existed," Nezu concluded. He stared at Izuku, his head ped to one side. "I'm sure you can see why this situation is perplexing to me." Izuku swallowed, then took another sip of his tea to avoid answering right away. It seemed childish to explain that he had planned on being a hero, but had given up that dream a few scant months before the UA entrance exams. Nearly as childish as the dream of being a hero itself. Still, he wasn't about to lie. "When I was younger I had intended to try and become a hero," Izuku admitted slowly. "I started analyzing heroes as a means of learning how it was done. I thought, if I knew enough about how heroes operated, if I knew enough about fighting styles to construct my own that would work for me, I could become a hero, even without a quirk." "You seem to have changed your mind," Nezu noted. There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity, and it made Izuku relax enough to say more. "I got some advice," he said, leaving out the bit about the advice coming from All Might. "I was told to be more realistic. My friend Kaken in particular was adamant that I give up on being a hero. Eventually I decided it was a childish dream for someone like me. Heroism isn't something you can learn by watching other people do it. I see, said Nezu shortly. Izuku looked up at him, unsure of when he had lowered his eyes to his lap. The principal's expression hadn't changed, but his tone and his demeanor somehow seemed different. Izuku got the decided impression he wasn't at all pleased with that answer. Well, Nezu went on before Izuku could figure out what he'd done wrong. I suppose there's the matter of your transfer. The support course, like the hero course, is very competitive. You will have to prove yourself before you can join. Trying to force down the way his heart clenched with fear, Izuku nodded decisively. I'm ready for whatever test you deem necessary. Good, said Nezu brightly. Class 1A will be taking their first lesson in rescue heroics today. They will be traveling to a distant corner of the campus, to a facility we call the USA. You will go with them, and while they practice using their quirks in a rescue scenario, you will provide real-time feedback and suggestions for improvement. If your analyses prove to be of material benefit to the class, you will be transferred to the support course as an analyst. Izuku gulped. Whatever he expected, it hadn't been that. Do real-time analysis? Provide feedback for the hero class? A class that contained Kaken? That was a lot of pressure. Still, as he looked at Nezu, he could sense a challenge in his words, and he recalled that working with the hero class was something he'd wanted to do. If he was going to work with Shinso, he'd have to work with the rest of the class too, doing work just like this. He couldn't back down now. Yes, sir, he said, setting down his teacup and inclining his head. Thank you for this opportunity. I will do my best. Excellent. Nezu beamed. The trip will be this afternoon, so get to your morning classes and meet the hero students outside after lunch. Yes, sir, Izuku repeated, then stood and picked up his bag. Midoriya, said Nezu, causing Izuku to turn back to him. I hope that, whatever the outcome of this test, we can have tea again? Of course, sir, Izuku said, nodding in agreement. Good, said Nezu, then sipped his tea. Run along now. Izuku left the office full of fresh determination. He was going to get the chance to transfer to the support course as an analyst. He knew what he had to do. Now all that was left was to do it. That's great news. Hatsume crowed, nearly throwing her chopsticks and bowl of rice into the air in excitement. Grains of rice rained down on the three of them where they were sat under their usual lunchtime tree, and Izuku couldn't help but feel Hatsume's unintentional rice throwing was a good omen. It seemed auspicious, even in the halting and uncertain terms Izuku had explained the situation in, and he was willing to take any piece of good luck he could get his hands on. Hatsume at the very least seemed ecstatic. Finally, you'll be moving up in the world. Hatsume insisted, crowding into Izuku's personal space in her usual enthusiastic manner. You'll be able to be in class with me all day, so we can run ideas by each other and work together to make the best babies on the market. Izuku laughed, trying not to let the idea of making babies together send his mind into untoward places. It should be fun, he agreed, letting Hatsume withdraw before leaning forward eagerly himself, though not nearly as close as his friend. What's class structured like? It seems like you're pretty much left to your own devices. Don't you receive any instruction? We do get tasks assigned at the beginning of the day, Hatsume told him with her mouth full, then swallowed. But they're really more like prompts to get our creative juices flowing. We're welcome to work on our own projects even if they have nothing to do with the assignment, as long as we get permission from sensei. He kind of wanders around making sure we're all on task and helping any of us if we get stuck. Izuku tugged on his lower lip, thinking. It'll probably be different for me, given that I'll be doing analysis work instead of building support items. I wonder what kind of work they'll have me doing during class? Night Eye said I wouldn't be the first analyst, and Nezu confirmed that this isn't an unheard-of case in the support course, so they must have some system in place for people like me. Maybe I'll be watching videos? I can do good analysis work based on videos. I started off just by watching the news before I could go out and see fights up close. Hatsume's laughter interrupted his thoughts, and Izuku suddenly sat up straight, realizing he'd been mumbling again. Sorry, he said sheepishly, I don't mean to be creepy. You're not creepy, Hatsume said between bites, and oddly enough she didn't really sound like she meant to reassure him. It was more like she was just stating a fact. Sensei says that you can learn a lot from conversations with yourself, just remember to let someone else in there sometimes to make sure you're not talking in circles. Izuku considered this for a moment. He'd really only ever thought of his mumbling as a bad habit, something he did that disrupted others. Could it actually be a good thing? Or even just part of the way he was, without being good or bad? Don't get lost in your head now, Mido, Shinso said, chiding but good-natured. Izuku looked up at him, to see him smiling a subdued smile as he picked at his lunch. Shin-chan? Izuku asked, suddenly worried. You don't seem all that happy. Is something wrong? No, said Shinso automatically, then took a large bite. Izuku and Hatsume continued to look at him while he chewed and swallowed, and when they didn't let up he sighed. I'm just gonna miss you, that's all. You don't have to miss me, Izuku said, mind racing as he tried to think of how to reassure his best friend. We can still eat lunch and train together, and I'm sure I'll be working with the hero courses at least sometimes. And it's not a sure thing yet anyway, I still have to pass Principal Nezu's test. Oh, you're getting into the support course, Shinso said seriously, giving Izuku a vicious smile. If you do your best, there's no way they won't see how amazing you are. I'm not amazing, Izuku said on a reflex, but before Shinso could say anything suddenly Hatsume was pulling at his cheek. Are so green bean, she said cheerfully. So do your best and you're sure to get in. All right, Izuku said, pulling out of Hatsume's grasp. I'll do my best. Good, said Shinso, pointing his chopsticks seriously at Izuku, because if you hold yourself back because of me, I'll have to feel bad when I get into the hero course, and I don't intend to do that. Izuku grinned and Shinso grinned back. Hatsume was already smiling, looking back and forth between the two of them in giddy excitement. Izuku didn't remember ever smiling or being smiled at this much ever in his life. This day, he decided, was good, and tomorrow would be even better. He would make it better, with Shinso and Hatsume right there beside him. After lunch, Izuku followed Nezu's instructions and went to the front of the school, where a handful of buses were already waiting. He was the first one there, and there were no teachers around, so he wasn't sure which bus he was supposed to get on. Was he even going to ride the buses with the hero students? Would that be allowed? How else was he supposed to get there, if this facility was in a distant corner of the campus? Deku! Came a familiar raspy shout, and Izuku squeaked and whirled around to face the front steps. Kaken was coming down them at a fair clip, both hands popping with small explosions and murder in his eyes as he looked at Izuku. Kaken, I can explain, Izuku said, but was immediately cut off. What are you doing here, you worthless little runt? Kaken demanded, leaping down the last few stairs for a running start at Izuku. I was Izuku began, eyes closed and hands held up defensively in front of himself. He waited for the inevitable pain of both his hands getting burned, but after a few seconds, more than enough time for Kaken to clear the distance between them, there was nothing. Izuku opened one eye, peering between his spread fingers to see Kaken several feet back, straining against Eraserhead's capture weapon. Can you calm down for 2 seconds? Eraser said waspishly, tugging Kaken back as he continued trying to get at Izuku. What the hell is he doing here? Kaken demanded. His hands were still sparking, but it seemed to do nothing against the fabric holding him. Midoriya is an analyst who's trying to transfer into the support course, said Eraser, voice somewhere between bored and annoyed. He's going to sit in on your lesson and give you feedback, so I expect you all to be courteous to him. Cool, came another voice from further up the stairs, and Izuku tore his eyes away from Kaken to see the rest of the hero class making their way more sedately down to the area where the buses were parked. They were all wearing their hero costumes, and they were all looking at Izuku. The student who had spoken, an odd-looking boy with spiky red hair and no shirt, began to run as soon as Izuku looked up, waving one hand excitedly. Watch this, he called, and once he was halfway down the staircase he suddenly jumped, covering the rest of the stairs in a single bound and coming down hard. Izuku gave a little cry of alarm and ran towards him, hoping he hadn't hurt himself too badly. He expected to have to help him up, but before he had even covered half the distance between them the boy was already getting to his feet, seeming completely uninjured. Izuku stopped, watching as the small dust cloud around his knees dissipated, to show that both his legs had become strangely angular, as though made from rough stone. "I'm Aijiro Kirishima," said the boy excitedly, flexing one arm with the opposite hand on his bicep. "My quirk's called hardening. I can make my body completely unbreakable to survive any impact and crush my opponents on the battlefield." As Izuku watched, the displayed arm also began to harden, taking on that angular quality like Kirishima's legs. Izuku had opted to take his bag with him, unsure of what he needed or what he'd be provided with, so before he knew what he was doing, he was going through the practiced motions of getting out his notebook and a pen. "A pretty useful quirk," Izuku began, already scribbling down his thoughts as he looked from the page to Kirishima's arm and back again. "Does it defend against extreme heat or cold?" "Probably heat, since that's just another kind of energy impact, but cold might be able to hurt you. You also might be able to cut it with a hard enough stone, like a diamond, so you should do some experiments as to how it holds up against various metals and minerals. How much control do you have over the shape the hardened flesh takes?" Izuku paused to look at Kirishima, to see him bearing a mouthful of sharp teeth. A little shock of fear shot through Izuku at the sight of them, and he stepped back nervously, but Kirishima merely began to laugh. "That's so cool, Midoriya," he said boisterously. "I'd never even thought about seeing how it holds up to a diamond, but that's a good point. They can break plexiglass, right? I should probably know if I'm weak to that." "Yeah," Izuku said, fear diminished with Kirishima's good spirits. "Lab-created diamonds are flawless and real cheap, so if you got famous enough and someone really wanted to take you down, they could easily make a weapon out of them. You should have a contingency plan for that." "If you're finished," said Eraser, drawing the attention of both Izuku and Kirishima, "we should load the buses now. We don't have all day." Izuku squeaked and nodded hurriedly. Before he could ask which bus to get on though, Kirishima was throwing an arm around his shoulders. "Come on, Midoriya," he said, dragging Izuku toward the nearest bus. "Sit by me." Izuku lost track of Kaken and what he was doing as they boarded the buses, so it was only once they were in motion that Izuku realized they'd somehow managed to get on the same bus. He wasn't sure if Kaken had meant it that way, but he was certainly glaring at Izuku heatedly from his seat near the back. Izuku, however, had immediately been swarmed by the other students, and was letting himself be too consumed by writing to worry about Kaken. "My quirk is called Naval Laser," simpered a blonde wearing what looked like medieval armor. "It's got the perfect combination of panache and strength." "But it's way lame if it gives you a stomachache, sweetie," said a girl with pink skin and dark eyes, a pair of horns peeking from amidst her wild pink hair. Izuku opened his mouth to make a suggestion, but before he could speak, a hand was waving in front of his face. He turned to see another blonde boy with spiky hair like Kaken's, this one wearing a black jacket and a radio on the side of his head. "I'm Denki Kaminari," said the boy, leaning back against the seat and trying to look nonchalant now that he had Izuku's attention. "My quirk's electrification. I can electrocute anyone who gets close to me and discharge electricity up to 1,300,000 volts." "What happens after 1,300,000 volts?" Izuku asked, already wondering about the limits of such an ability. "His brain short-circuits and he turns into a gibbering idiot for an hour," said a girl with what looked like headphone jacks dangling from the lobes of her ears. Izuku looked down at his notes and began scribbling again, trying to get down all the information he was being bombarded with. He already had lots of ideas, his mind spinning in 5 directions at once, but he did his best to limit himself to actionable suggestions for the moment. He tried to write down as many as he could, knowing he'd need to bring them up during the exercise while he was being observed. He couldn't afford to waste all his suggestions now, when no one was watching. "Hey Bakugo," said the girl next to Izuku, who he vaguely remembered asking him to call her Tsu. "Don't you want to tell Midoriya about your quirk? Usually you love to show off." Kaken took his eyes off Izuku to glare at Tsu for a moment. "I don't need some stupid Deku to tell me my quirk is the best. I know I'm better than all you extras." Tsu, who did not look the least bit intimidated by Kaken's yelling, opened her mouth to respond. Feeling it prudent to not let her say whatever she was about to say, Izuku leaned into her field of vision, blocking Kaken from her view. "Actually, Kaken and I have known each other since we were little," Izuku explained, hoping this would be enough to satisfy her. I already know all about his quirk. Well, that explains why you're so skilled, Bakugo, giggled the pink girl. If you've had a professional analyst in your corner from day one, I'll bet that was a huge advantage. What the hell did you just say? Kaken shouted, standing up from his seat to lean toward her menacingly. I don't need Deku's help with anything, or anyone's help for that matter. He's just a little bug I can squish whenever I want. With this he turned to Izuku, eyes full of fire and hands already starting to smoke. Izuku knew what was coming, and instinctively he curled in on himself, shielding his notebook with his body. That notebook was what was going to get him into the support course. He couldn't let it be destroyed. There was a loud boom, and again Izuku braced himself for pain, but after a few seconds when no pain was forthcoming he opened his eyes and looked up. Kirishima, who had been seated between Izuku and Kaken, had stood up from his seat as well, and was now standing right in what must have been the path of the explosion. His arms were hardened into jagged shields crossed in front of his face, both of them smeared with soot now. As Izuku watched he lowered his defenses to glare at Kaken, who had transferred his attention to this new opponent. Not cool, bro, Kirishima said, sounding almost angry on Izuku's behalf. Midoriya's not a hero student, his intelligence quirk's not gonna protect him from a physical attack. Using your quirk on people who can't fight back is so unmanly. Kaken let out a roar of rage and moved his hand out toward Kirishima, but nothing happened. He blinked in confusion, then looked up toward the front of the bus, and when Izuku turned he could see a racer glaring back at them, his hair up around his head and his eyes blazing red with his quirk. No quirk use on the bus, he said simply, then dropped his quirk and sat back in his seat. You're disturbing my nap. Izuku turned back to the other students, still tense with nerves as he waited for Kaken's reaction. Kaken, however, simply gave a little huff of frustration and threw himself back into his seat. Izuku let out a shaky breath, trying to feel relieved, but he felt more like he'd been granted a stay of execution. You okay, Midoriya? Asked Kirishima, putting one hand on Izuku's shoulder. Oh! Izuku squeaked, then cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you though, for saving me. Hey, I'm a hero student, Kirishima said brightly. Saving people is hopefully gonna be my job. Izuku nodded, then considered his next statement carefully. It would be better, he decided, to get things out in the open now, rather than have it come out later. Also, you were mistaken earlier, he said, trying not to let his fear show in his voice. From behind Kirishima, he heard Kaken give an anticipatory scoff. Oh? Kirishima asked innocently. About what? I don't have an intelligence quirk, Izuku explained, unable to meet Kirishima's eye. Actually, I don't have any quirk. Silence reigned for a moment, and Izuku braced himself for the worst. Hatsume and Shinso hadn't minded that he was quirkless, but these were hero students. Quirks were everything to them, how they defined themselves and each other, how they organized themselves, how they decided who was and wasn't worth their time. Now they knew he was quirkless, he would become like a bug to them, a pebble in their path to— That's so manly, Kirishima exclaimed. Izuku's head snapped up, his eyes popping open to stare at Kirishima. He was smiling again, his sharp teeth on full display but somehow not threatening at all, and he clapped Izuku on the arm as though in congratulations. Izuku couldn't think of a single thing to say, so he simply stared dumbly. Yeah, it's pretty impressive that you can do all that without a quirk, Tsu piped up from his other side, making Izuku turn to look at her instead, still struck completely speechless. I thought for sure you had some kind of analysis quirk. Do you have a hero parent or something? No, Izuku shook his head, and once he had that word out talking became easier. I've just been really fascinated by heroes since I was a little kid, so I studied them as much as I could. I guess I got pretty good at picking apart what made them effective, so from there what they need to improve on seems obvious. It's just a hobby right now, but I think I can turn it into something more. He turned to the rest of the bus, inclining his head towards the hero students. With your help, I'm sure I can do it, so let's all do our best and help each other, okay? The response was a rousing chorus of, okay. This way, Midoriya, called Eraser as Izuku got off the bus. Izuku turned, once again laboring under the weight of Kirishima's arm around his shoulders. The rest of the students were filing toward the main entrance to the huge dome structure, but Eraser was beckoning Izuku off to one side. Izuku looked at Kirishima, who gave one final grin and released him, instead heading over to Kaminari and another boy with tape dispensers in his elbows. Eraser led Izuku around the outside of the structure. They were almost a quarter of the way around, the main entrance out of sight, when they came upon an ordinary metal door, like a service entrance. Eraser opened it with a swipe of his ID card, and inside Izuku found a small, boxy room lined with TV monitors. There was another door in one wall, presumably to inside the facility, and a large control table covered in buttons and dials. The monitors showed the various areas inside the facility: a fire zone, a shipwreck zone, a rockslide zone, a storm zone. "This is the control room," Eraser explained, indicating the lone swivel chair for Izuku to sit down in. "There are cameras all over the facility, so you should be able to see everyone at all times. All the students are being given earpieces so they can communicate with you." Izuku pulled the chair out, to find a clipboard on the seat. He picked it up and flipped through the pages clipped to it, finding a list of every student in the class, complete with names, pictures, and channel numbers. "The microphone is here." Eraser drew his attention to a small microphone on a little stand, easily picked up and moved around for convenience sake. "Press and hold this button to turn it on, and this dial controls which channel will hear. Channel 21 broadcasts on all earpiece channels, and Channel 0 will project your voice throughout the facility." Izuku swallowed nervously, making a mental note not to turn the dial to 0. "There's also a camera here." Eraser indicated a small, easily missed lens between two monitors, pointed directly at the chair. "It'll record what you do for us to review later, and if you hit this button here he pointed at a blue button at the far end of the panel, you can project your image over the main floor." "Why would I need that?" Izuku asked, dizzy with the idea of pressing the blue button even by mistake. "The floor's open to give an inspiring speech," Eraser said, with a sly little smile that reminded Izuku of Shinso. "Just wait until I get back to the class. Are you all set?" Izuku nodded gravely. "Then good luck," Eraser said, and left out the door that lead into the facility. Izuku stood there a moment, trying to control his racing heart. It was hard not to feel like an intruder here. Didn't have much time, so instead of dwelling on his fear he took his seat and began flipping through the pages on the clipboard, familiarizing himself with everyone's quirks. He kept one eye on the monitors, watching as Eraser made his way back to the class. The facility was built sort of like a theme park, with designated disaster areas contained in smaller domes. The center of the facility was an open plaza, and Eraser skirted the edge of this as he headed for the main staircase leading up to the entrance. He had just made it up the stairs and back to where the class was being welcomed to the facility by 13 when Izuku noticed it. It was difficult to see on the monitor, but the central plaza between all the disaster areas was no longer empty. In the middle of the space, floating a few feet off the floor, was a strange purple something. Izuku looked closer, wondering if the central plaza was also the site of a simulation. The purple thing was fluctuating at the edges as though it were made of dark fire, and it seemed to be getting bigger. Suddenly Izuku realized he had no means of contacting Eraser or 13 to ask what it might be. It grew and grew until it was a large circle in the air, like a hole in space large enough to drive a car through. The class of hero students had noticed the thing now, and Eraser and 13 had turned toward it, their expressions unreadable by the distant cameras. Quickly Izuku checked his papers, then turned the dial to change his broadcast channel. "Yayorozu?" he asked tentatively. "Class rep? What is that thing?" "I don't know," came the reply, the voice's aristocratic quality doing nothing to overshadow its anxiety. "I don't think it's supposed to be here." She stopped, and Izuku could see why. Out of the purple portal, for that was undoubtedly what it was, came people. First one and then another, until a whole flood of them were spilling into the facility. Izuku watched mesmerized as they spread themselves out across the floor, facing off against the now comparatively smaller cluster of hero students. Some of them had weapons. All of them had very obvious quirks. Movement on a different monitor caught Izuku's eye, and he turned to see that the massive door behind the hero students was starting to close. They were being locked in. The USJ was under attack. Tenya had heard about Midoriya, of course. The Ida family was close-knit, and Tenya was very close to his brother. As such, they spoke often, whether it be on Tensei's visits home or over the phone, during their bi-weekly phone call approximately 2 hours before bed. Tensei had mentioned the curious discovery of present mix that was traveling in a ripple through the hero community, first locally and then further to the rest of Japan. A set of notebooks full of truly enlightening analyses, and the first-year UA student who had apparently written them. Tenya had been curious which of his classmates was such a gifted analyst, but Tensei said that it was a Gen Ed student who would surely soon be transferring to the support course. Tensei had always been one to work as closely as possible with his talented support staff, and he encouraged Tenya to be kind to the boy when he inevitably began working with the hero classes to perfect his analysis skills. Hero work could entail just as much networking as any other high-profile profession, and it was an area Tenya needed to work on. This analyst, who would surely be in high demand upon graduation, would be an excellent subject on which to practice those skills. When Aizawa-sensei had announced that the mousy-looking boy with untidy green hair standing by the buses was the analyst Tenya had heard about, he'd wanted to go talk to him right away, to try and make him feel welcome. Kirishima, however, had immediately monopolized his attention, and Tenya's duty as the vice president of the class had ended up mandating that he not ride the same bus as the two of them. As they entered the USJ, Tenya was just deciding that he'd simply have to take whatever suggestions were offered him gracefully and then thank Midoriya humbly when class was over. Then, once they were inside the USJ, the warp gate opened, and Tenya stood frozen in horror alongside his classmates as what were clearly villains streamed into the facility. He didn't know what to do. Things like this simply didn't happen at UA High School. This had to be some part of the simulation, another logical ruse, like Aizawa-sensei's quirk assessments, but villains weren't what this facility was supposed to be for. And Ida, came a voice in Tenya's ear, snapping him out of his trance. Midoriya, Tenya said, touching his earpiece so it would pick up his voice. Do you know what we're dash? You have to run, Midoriya's voice interrupted. You have to get back to the main campus and get help. What? Tenya sputtered. And abandon my classmates? Vice President. The formal address by his title made Tenya straighten his back. Think about what's happening. Those people aren't supposed to be here, yet they got in with no trouble. The alarms aren't going off, so no one knows they're here. We have 2 pros and 20 hero students, and I already count 30 villains out there. We need backup, that's what the class needs from you right now. You're right, of course, Tenya agreed, but still he hesitated. But Dash, you're the fastest. Midoriya's voice rose in pitch as he began to speak more emphatically. The doors are closing. Go, go, go. Tenya looked behind himself to see that the enormous doors were in fact sliding shut behind them. As he stood there, paralyzed with indecision, a piece of advice Tensei had once given him rang in his ears. Remember that you're part of a team, Tensei had said. You do what the team needs, regardless of how glamorous it is or how useless it feels. People are counting on you, Tenya. Without giving it another thought, Tenya revved his engines and shot straight through the gap in the doors. Once he was outside, he heard them close ominously behind him, but he paid them no attention. He had to get to the main campus. His classmates were counting on him. Izuku realized the flaw in his system as soon as he saw the class all react as one to something Eraser said. He could get in contact with the individual students through their earpieces, but not only did Eraser and 13 not have earpieces, but he couldn't hear what was going on the main floor. Judging by the way one of the villains, a gray-haired man with what looked like disembodied hands grasping him all over his body, was gesturing with his arms, he was saying something. The students and pros could hear it. Izuku could not. Yaoyorozu? He asked, turning the dial back to the class president's channel as soon as he had finished persuading Ida to get help. What's he saying? He's saying he's here to kill All Might, Yaoyorozu explained. He intends to start killing students until All Might arrives. Then you have to get into a formation, Izuku told her, his mind already racing ahead of him. get the class to cluster together, and dash. Before Izuku could finish, two things happened in quick succession. First, Eraser leaped down the stairs, throwing himself into the mass of villains to face them head-on. Izuku felt his heart jump into his throat as the vanguard turned their attention to the hero before them, already aiming what looked like projectile quirks at him. Eraser wasn't suited to big group fights. He was a precision instrument meant for stealth missions and single combat. Izuku braced himself, sure he was about to watch Eraser get overwhelmed by the three in front, but as he watched transfixed, all three of them looked in confusion down at their own hands long enough for the capture weapon to seize all of them and knock their heads together, dropping them unconscious to the ground. Whoa! Izuku breathed, uncaring that he was still on Yaoyorozu's channel. Then, as Eraser turned his attention to a large, beefy villain with an obvious mutation quirk, the second thing happened. The warp quirk villain suddenly vanished from his position in the center of the floor and reappeared between the students and the door. The class was already trying to follow Ida, but they all stopped when the villain blocked their way. Izuku again cursed his lack of audio. He couldn't see the villain's mouth moving, but he knew he was talking, and any hint as to their plans could make or break his counterattack strategy. He wasn't entirely sure when he'd decided that he was going to form a counterattack strategy, but he wasn't about to question the decision now. Desperately, Izuku turned the dial to channel 21, hoping that all the earpieces at once would be able to pick something up. In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter, came a many-layered voice, faint but unmistakably the voice of the villain. I still have a role to play. Izuku couldn't see 13's fingers at this distance, but he could see them raising their arm, and he knew they were about to use their quirk to reduce this villain to dust. He hoped it would work, the villain seeming to be somewhat non-corporeal, but he had faith that 13 would be able to do something. Then, before 13 could SCK the villain up, suddenly Kaken and Kirishima were leaping forward. No! Izuku shouted, standing up in his chair, but it was too late. His view was obscured by a cloud of smoke from Kaken's quirk, and by the time it cleared, Kaken and Kirishima were standing between the villain and 13. Get out of the way! Izuku shouted desperately, and faintly he heard 13 calling the same instruction. They were not given time to react though, the villain was already speaking again. I'll scatter you throughout this facility, to meet my comrades and your deaths. Again Izuku's vision was obscured, this time by a massive dome of the same dark energy the villain seemed to be made of. He could hear exclamations of alarm coming through the earpieces, but he couldn't see anything that was happening. Then suddenly the dome vanished, and Izuku looked on in horror to see that everyone who had been underneath it was gone. Izuku's eyes darted to the other cameras, hoping to catch some glimpse of the others. As he watched, he saw swirling purple portals open all around, on over half the monitors displaying the various disaster zones. Each one spat out a handful of students, who landed with wildly varying degrees of grace, and then closed. For a moment, Izuku allowed himself to breathe. He was still tuned to channel 21, so he could hear all of the students exclaiming in alarm, but he had released the button on the microphone, so they could not hear him for the moment. His hands were shaking as he flipped through the pages on his clipboard, making mental notes of where everyone had landed. He had accounted for almost all of them by the time he started to hear voices calling his name, students wondering where they had ended up and whether everyone else was all right. Maybe if he could. Suddenly the door to the control room, the one that led to the interior of the facility, banged open. Izuku jumped and spun around, to see a skinny, nearly skeletal villain with no shirt and a bald head. He reached for Izuku with long fingers that seemed to have too many joints, grinning wickedly, but before he could get far, suddenly another body collided with his. He and another villain, this one bigger and stronger looking, both slammed into the doorframe, then dropped unconscious to the floor. Uraraka! Izuku exclaimed as a girl with nut-brown hair and round, rosy cheeks came around the door. He had only seen her briefly before getting on the bus, but he had seen her name beside her picture. Release, she said, pressing all 5 of her fingers together, and the bigger villain fell deeper into his slump. Then she turned to Izuku. You should know there are a handful of villains heading for this control room. Thankfully I was dumped between you and them. Izuku looked at the monitors again. Sure enough, as he watched the various hero students get their bearings, each group suddenly found themselves squaring off against yet more villains. In every instance they were outnumbered, but none of the students looked ready to give up, and all of them were preparing to face their opponents. "You should get out of here while you can," Uraraka said, drawing Izuku's attention back to her. She gave him a determined look, one clenched fist held up before her. "It's my duty as a hero student to get the civilians out safe. Take the outside door and I'll cover you." Izuku hesitated. He looked back at the monitors, at the hero students who were drawing their weapons and firing up their quirks. He looked at the door to the outside, to a retreat that would probably save his life. He looked at Uraraka, willing to go down fighting to give him a chance to escape. Izuku shook his head. "I have to stay and help," he said resolutely. "That's what I'm here for and that's what I'm going to do. If you can handle the villains for a little while, I think I can help guide everyone out of the areas where they've been trapped and get them back to the center. Then we can all face this together, okay?" Uraraka looked at him worriedly for a moment, then her face broke out in a vicious smile. "Okay," she said enthusiastically. "If you want to be brave, I won't stand in your way. I'll hold off the villains for as long as I can." Izuku nodded, and Uraraka nodded back. Then she reached in and pulled the door shut, leaving Izuku alone in the control room once again. Izuku took a deep breath and went back to his seat. After a quick glance at the monitors, he turned the dial. Sue? Izuku said into the microphone. "Is the ship you're on sinking?" "Yep," Tsuyu said into her earpiece, watching as water rushed into the middle of the boat. "We're definitely sinking and there's a lot of those villains in the water. I don't think I can fight them on my own, Ribbit." "Let me just ask Mineta something," Izuku said, and the earpiece went dead. Tsuyu went to watch the horde of villains in the water as Mineta explained how his quirk worked to Midoriya. There certainly were a lot of them, their heads peeking out from the water like the fins of sharks, but none of them were coming any closer just yet. Probably they were waiting for the ship to submerge, leaving her and Mineta vulnerable in the water. "Hey Midoriya," said Tsuyu as Mineta finished and her own earpiece began to emit the slight static that meant Midoriya's mic was back on. "It seems like these guys don't really know what we're capable of necessarily. They seem to want us to come to them, rather than engaging us out of their element." "Perfect," said Midoriya. "That means they'll all go into the ship once it's underwater. You're going to set a trap." After they had their preparations finished, Tsuyu stuck herself to the ceiling of the highest room in the ship, waiting for their trap to spring. Mineta had already groped her once, so she held him as far away as possible with her tongue. She had half a mind to leave him there, but it had been his quirk that would supposedly get them out of here. "What are these things?" came the voice of one of the villains from deeper in the ship, the part that was already underwater. "Hey, I'm stuck," came another voice. Soon a chorus of complaints were coming up from below, and Tsuyu decided it was time to climb out onto the roof. She surveyed the water around the ship, to find that it was completely devoid of villains. All of them had gone into the ship to look for them, and all of them had been caught in Mineta's sticky ball they had placed in long strings trailing off every surface. "Good thinking, Midoriya," said Tsuyu as she leaped high in the air, dragging a screaming Mineta behind her. "Where to now, Ribbit?" "The Central Plaza," Midoriya said into her ear. "I have another plan." Momo jammed the base of her staff into another villain's eye, knocking him backwards a couple of steps and clearing the space around her once more. Beside her, Kaminari and Jiraiya were dealing with villains of their own, but didn't look like they needed her help right now. She looked around, seeing no other immediate threats, and put a hand to her earpiece once more. "Midoriya?" she tried again, hoping that he would hear her this time. To her surprise, the earpiece crackled to life. "Yaoyorozu," came Midoriya's voice, high but determined. "Thank goodness," Momo sighed. "I thought you might be hurt. Are there villains at the control room? Are you safe?" "There are, but Uraraka's taking care of them," Midoriya assured her. "Are you doing all right?" "I think I have a plan to finish off these villains." "So do I," Momo said, keeping her voice low enough that Midoriya could hear, but the villains could not. "I'm going to make a sheet of insulation to cover myself and Jiraiya, so Kaminari can go all out against these guys." "I have a better idea," Midoriya said immediately. Make a metal net. A metal net? Momo questioned. One of the villains was starting to edge closer again, so she swung her staff, catching him on the side of the head. What good will that do? Cast it over the villains, Midoriya said. If you and Jiraiya can get behind Kaminari, he should be able to electrify the net without overloading himself. That last thing you need is a gibbering idiot wandering around right now. Momo considered this, then nodded. Good idea, she said, realizing that Midoriya probably couldn't see such a minute movement on the cameras. It'll be less work for me too. She turned her back on the villains and concentrated on the molecular structure of copper, the best conductor of any metal strong enough to make wire. It was easier to make a crisscrossing pattern of simple copper wire rather than a thick sheet of insulation, so almost immediately it was flying out of the back window in her costume and settling over the villains. She grabbed Jiraiya and pulled her out of the way before the net could come down, ducking behind Kaminari. Don't go overboard, she called to Kaminari, who seemed to have gotten the idea. He grabbed hold of the net, and with a loud buzzing and the sickening smell of burning hair, every villain in front of them was on the ground. Nice work, said Midoriya's voice in her ear. You've got one more guy to deal with. I think he has an electricity quirk, but he should be weak to Jiraiya's sound attack. After that, head to your right, and you should come to the exit of your zone pretty fast. Where to from there? Momo asked, leaning on her staff. The Central Plaza, Midoriya told her. I have an idea. Shudo looked at the villains trapped in his ice with contempt. Honestly, they had barely even put up a fight. If they intended to infiltrate a place like UA, then they had better be ready to deal with people who had trained their whole lives to be heroes. They ought to be ashamed of their weak attempts at threatening hero students. He was just about to lecture them on that very point when suddenly his earpiece crackled to life for the first time. Todoroki, came the voice on the other end, the analyst who had come with them. Yes. Shudo asked, unsure of what Midoriya could want from him. I don't think this is the time to be making notes on my performance. If you want notes, you should probably pay more attention to who you have with you, Midoriya told him, his voice oddly steady. Shudo thought he remembered it being shaky and nervous before. Hagakure got dropped in the same place you did, so be careful not to catch her in your ice. Noted, Shudo said, recalling now that he'd heard the sound of running feet somewhere behind him, but hadn't seen anything when he'd looked back. Is there anything else? Just that you can get out of your zone by going around that outcropping to your left, then heading straight down, Midoriya told him. After that, head for the center. I have every intention of going to help our teacher, Shudo informed him, a little annoyed that Midoriya would doubt it. Good, Midoriya said, not seeming at all fazed by whatever annoyance had shown in his tone. Maybe none had. Please hurry, we're going to need the entire class if my plan is going to work. What plan? Shudo asked, interested despite himself. You'll see, said Midoriya cryptically, then the connection cut off. Shudo sighed and headed in the direction he'd been given. Midoriya had more courage than he'd given the Gen Ed student credit for, if he had stuck around this long. He might have escaped with his life, but he had stayed, and apparently come up with a plan. There was something to be admired in that, in perseverance despite such limitations. Shudo was certain his father wouldn't see it that way, so he decided to follow along with whatever scheme Midoriya was orchestrating. Anything that set him apart from Endeavor was a good idea. Idru felt really bad about getting in the way. In hindsight, it seemed obvious what he should have done, letting the pros handle it without getting involved unless he had to. He had been so eager to prove himself, to prove he could be strong and save people, that he hadn't even thought twice before jumping into the fray. He had acted rashly, and he had endangered the lives of his classmates. This was all his fault. The only thing he could do now was try to be better, he thought as he smashed one hardened arm against a villain's skull. He had to get through this, take care of these thugs, and then get back to somewhere he could help. He knew Aizawa-sensei would have his hands full with the horde in the middle of the facility, so he had to do whatever he could to lighten that load. The villain who had spoken about All Might, and the villain with the warp quirk, seemed to be in charge. If he could take them out, the attack would be over. Beside him, Bakugo was making equally quick work of the villains that had come after them. He was brutally efficient, taking out first one and then another, none of them managing to pin or sneak up on him. Aizawa had to admit, the fire zone was a pretty ideal place for someone with an explosion quirk to be fighting. No risk of lighting anything on fire when it was already burning. "Kirishima?" came Midoriya's voice in his ear, just as they were clearing a room. "Midoriya?" Aizawa asked, one hand to his earpiece. "You're in the control room, right? What's happening out there?" "I'm guiding everyone towards the center," Midoriya said. "Get out on the street, then I'll tell you which way to go." Without any more encouragement, Aizawa ran for the door. He could hear Bakugo yelling behind him, but the other boys seemed to be following, so he didn't look back. Once they were out on the street, Aizawa turned to him. "Midoriya's going to guide us out," he said, indicating his earpiece. "We should dash." "Like hell I'm listening to that little beastie," Bakugo yelled, explosions popping from his hands. "He's just trying to make me look bad. I'll find my own way out of here." With that he took off down the street, running full tilt into the inferno. "Bakugo!" Aizawa called, but if Bakugo heard him, he didn't respond. Aizawa swore, looking after his classmate. The kind thing to do would be to go after him, try to persuade him to follow directions. An uncharitable part of his brain told him that none of the teachers had ever gotten Bakugo to follow directions, so his chances of achieving that were slim. Still, would it be a greater mistake to leave the rest of his classmates in the lurch? With another frustrated sound, Aizawa touched his earpiece. "Which way am I going, Midoriya?" he asked, turning away from where Bakugo had taken off. "Pretty much the opposite direction from Kaken," Midoriya said, sounding a little sheepish. "Go to the end of the next block, then hang a left. The exit should be right in front of you." Aizawa sprinted along the path Midoriya had laid out for him, trying not to breathe in the smoke. The air was hot and dry here, and it burned his lungs as he ran. At the end of the block he turned left, and sure enough saw a glowing exit sign not 10 yards ahead. "Thanks, Midoriya," he said, and in a few moments he was bursting out of the fire zone, completely on his own. Izuku sighed as he watched Kirishima leave the fire zone without Kaken. He'd hoped that coming from a hero classmate Kaken would find taking direction more palatable, but apparently not. Still, no one could say he hadn't tried. Suddenly there came a banging on the inside door, and Izuku jumped. "Uraraka?" he called nervously, making sure his finger was off the button to activate the microphone. "Get out of here." Uraraka's voice came through the door. "There's more of them, but I'm exhausted. I can't use my quirk anymore." Izuku didn't give himself time to think, he launched himself out of his chair and went to the door. When he jerked it open, Uraraka fell forward inside, apparently having been leaning against it. Ignoring her protests, he dragged her into the control room, then stuck his head out to have a look. 3 villains were advancing on the control room. One of them was big, with a mutation quirk that made him look like a humanoid panther. Another one had a big metal plate on his chest with a series of holes in it, which Izuku was willing to bet shot something out of them. The third didn't have an obvious quirk, but his expression was cruel enough to send shivers down Izuku's spine. "Hold on," Izuku said to Uraraka, and closed the door behind himself. The panther villain was bringing up the rear, with the 2 in front level with each other and the third standing between them, but a few feet back. Izuku immediately darted between the 2 leads, drawing their attention onto himself as he faced off against the projectile user. "Hit me," he invited cheerfully, surprised by the way his voice didn't shake. The holes in the metal plate began to glow, but Izuku was already moving, and before they had fired he was out of the way. He heard the other villain scream as he was hit. "One down." "BSC," screamed the downed villain as Izuku dove between Panther's legs. There was a strange, squishy thump, and when Izuku popped back to his feet behind his third opponent, he could see the villain on the ground grinning viciously, his arm having elongated into some kind of spear, down which dark red blood was running. 2 down. Panther was starting to turn around, so Izuku crouched and jumped as high as he could. He managed to get a fair amount of the way up the villain's broad back, and grabbing handfuls of fur he began to drag himself upwards. Panther growled, and a paw came back to swipe at him, but the angle was awkward and so the claws barely grazed his side. As soon as he was high enough, Izuku reached out and bit down hard on the back of Panther's neck. Immediately Panther slumped, The automatic response, all cats had to being grasped by the back of the neck, kicking in and making his body seize up. Izuku held tight as he went crashing to the ground, teeth still dug into baggy flesh. He knew he didn't have long, so without letting go he looked around for a heavy object, and found that one of the villains Uraraka had taken care of had lost a steel-toed boot. Izuku grabbed it, and holding it as best he could, he brought the metal down hard on the back of Panther's skull. 3 down. The villain beneath him went limp, and when Izuku released him and sat up, he didn't move. Neither did the other 2 villains. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief, but before he could congratulate himself too much he saw the door to the control room opening, and Uraraka poked her head out. "Holy cow," she said, staring at the 3 downed villains. "No time," said Izuku, standing on shaky legs and running back to the control room. "How long do you need to rest? Even if you can't use your quirk, can you stand and look menacing?" "Just another minute," Uraraka said. She wiped sweat off her forehead, then grinned savagely. "If I don't need to use my quirk, I can at least stand on my own 2 feet. "Good," said Izuku, and shut the door behind himself. "Take a minute, then get to the center. This strategy is going to take all of us. Are you going to be okay here on your own?" Uraraka asked nervously. "That was the last of them," Izuku said. "Everyone else has pretty much finished off their villains. We may not look like much, but we're winning." "Good," said Uraraka, then leaned against the wall, eyes closed. "That's good." Shoyuta watched as another villain went down, felled by his capture weapon without his even needing to touch them. He was nearly finished taking out these thugs, but he estimated there were more in waiting, and every minute he wasted on this battle was a minute his students were fighting alone. He knew what they were capable of, and he knew they could hold their own. He also knew that if one of them got hurt, or worse, he'd never forgive himself. The villain covered in hands seemed to be the leader, but he apparently wasn't content to hang back anymore, and as Shoyuta turned to him he suddenly found the villain racing towards. He was muttering something, but Shoyuta wasn't paying much attention. "Final boss," Shoyuta concluded as he darted to meet the villain. He slammed into the villain with one arm, but immediately found himself caught as the villain stood his ground and stopped his assault without toppling over. As the villain continued to taunt him, he kept his quirk activated for as long as possible, but before long the urge to blink became too strong and he closed his eyes. Immediately a searing pain his elbow revealed that it was pressed to the villain's palm, and this villain apparently had a touch-based quirk. "Don't push yourself too hard now," the villain said mockingly. "You might just fall apart." Shoyuta leaped back, putting some distance between him and the villain. A few of the stragglers surrounded him, but he made quick work of them despite his injury. The villain was still talking, but Shoyuta was more focused on fighting. That was probably why he didn't see it. "By the way," said the hand villain as Shoyuta turned to see the big fellow who had previously hung back beside his leader just behind him. "I am not the final boss." The enormous man raised one massive clawed hand, and Shoyuta braced himself for pain. It didn't come. Instead, a huge ice wall erupted between him and his opponent, stopping the blow but raining ice chunks down on Shoyuta. He leaped back, out of the way, then looked around wildly for Todoroki. Instead of just Todoroki, however, he found himself surrounded, but not by enemies. Nearly all of his students were standing at the edge of his battlefield, forming a ring around the 3 remaining villains. He wasn't sure how any of them had gotten out of their own battles so quickly, but the only one he counted missing besides Ida was Bakugo. He hoped that didn't mean the hothead had gotten himself hurt. Shoyuta looked back at the hand villain, waiting for his reaction. The fight wasn't over yet. "Well, it seems we have company," said the villain with all the hands, looking around at the assembled students. "I guess UA students really do live up to their school's reputation." Izuku, listening in on 18 out of 20 earpieces, took a deep breath. Now was the time. Everyone was assembled, which meant it was time for him to take the lead. If his plan was going to work, it would have to be now. He steeled his courage, turned the dial to channel 0, and pressed the blue button. "That's right," said Izuku, looking into the camera. He could see the holographic projection of a screen hovering over everything on the monitors. The positioning was a little off, but it was in full view of the villains. "Those students made pretty quick work of your forces, And now I'd say they're a little bit ticked off. You're the only one left for them to take that anger out on. Quickly he switched the dial to channel 21 again, anxious to hear what the villain would say to that. This isn't right, the villain was saying, less to Izuku and more to himself. This isn't right. All Might was supposed to be here. My Nomu was supposed to destroy him. I checked the news on my way into school today. Izuku informed him, trying to sound authoritative, not sure he managed it. All Might stopped 3 different crimes in the time it took me to ride the train. Clearly he has better things to do than teach a class today. The schedule said he would be here, snapped the villain, answering one question for Izuku. What do you want to bet on? Izuku asked. A heroes need to do good, or a list of things that were supposed to happen? The villain growled, scratching agitatedly at his neck. No fair, he said indignantly. My Nomu has 3 of the best quirks, the perfect combination for destroying All Might. How can I kill him if he won't come out and face me? 3 quirks? How was that possible? He had to be some kind of genetic experiment. Izuku's mind reeled, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. Sounds like you better rethink your plan, Izuku said. He was speaking louder now, and though he was unsure of why, it made his voice steadier. Better to take your tinker toy and try again another day. Why should I? The villain said petulantly. My Nomu can take out all of you. And still beat All Might when it's done. Can it? Izuku couldn't raise one eyebrow, but he gave his best condescending look. You're surrounded by a whole class of hero students and a pro. They've wiped the floor with every villain you brought with you, and they're not prone to giving up. Do you think Nomu can take them? All of them? The villain growled again, but said nothing. He scratched his neck, looking left and right, trying to make a decision. Tamura Shigaraki, said the warp quirk villain suddenly, drawing the hand villain's attention. It may be time for a tactical retreat. We may win this fight, but at what cost? Perhaps it is better to withdraw. Izuku said nothing. The hero students said nothing. Eraserhead said nothing. The whole facility was quiet as they waited for the villain's Shigaraki's decision. Fine, said Shigaraki. Take us home, Kurogyri. The warp villain made another dome, this one encompassing Shigaraki and the Nomu. Eraser had to jump out of the way to avoid being caught as well, but he managed to stumble away before the circle of dark energy vanished, taking with it the leaders of the villains. In their wake they left nothing but a wall of ice and the scattered, unconscious bodies of their comrades. There was no one left to fight. A cheer went up from the hero students, and as Izuku watched, even Eraser's shoulders slumped in relief. Izuku hit the blue button again, banishing the holographic screen, before collapsing back in his chair. All the strength seemed to have gone out of him, leaving him bone-weary and exhausted. It was over. It was over. Midoriya, came a voice through the speaker, and Izuku had to think for a moment to identify it as Todoroki's. Yeah, he replied, turning the dial to the proper channel. You realize you may have made yourself a target of this villain, don't you? Asked Todoroki's voice. There was something in it, almost like worry, but he was too stoic for Izuku to be sure. Someone like him doesn't forget being bested like this. Izuku gave a faint smile, even though Todoroki couldn't see him. If it gets everyone out of here safe, then it's worth any risk to me. There was a moment of silence, during which Izuku wondered if Todoroki was done talking to him. That's very brave of you, Todoroki said at last. No, it's not, Izuku shook his head tiredly. Yes, said Todoroki. It is. All right, Izuku admitted, maybe it isn't over yet. Hizashi bolted down the stairs, uncaring of how dignified it was or wasn't to rush in. As he went he counted students. Gathered in a ring around Shoyuda, there were 18 total. With Ida amongst the reinforcements, there should be 20 counting Midoriya. Where was Midoriya? He took the last few stairs at a flying leap, using a slight burst of his quirk to break his fall. All the villains seemed to be down, unconscious or immobile on the floor. None of the students he could see were hurt, or at least not hurt enough for it to be pressing, so he darted between Tokoyami and Hagakure and went immediately to Shoyuda. Where's Midoriya? He asked urgently, gripping Shoyuda by the arms. Shoyuda grunted as though in pain, and Hisashi looked down to see that his elbow seemed to be missing most of its skin, bloody flesh exposed as though the outer layer had been peeled away. "You're hurt!" Hisashi cried, a little louder than he'd meant to judging by Shuta's wince. "I'm fine," Shoyuta assured him, straightening a little. "Midoriya's in the control room, but you might want to go check on him. Uraraka came from that direction, and she's in pretty bad shape." Hisashi looked over in the direction of the control room, to find that Uraraka had indeed collapsed to the floor. She was being tended to by Yaoyorozu, who had produced a paper fan and was vigorously waving it at Uraraka's shining face. He looked back at Shoyuta, guilt gnawing at him, unsure of where he should be. Would any of the villains even be interested in the control room? Hisashi asked, trying to make the choice easier. "If not before, they are now," Shoyuta told him. He put on a truly heroic display, got the leaders to retreat. If any villains are still conscious, that's where they'll be headed. A heroic display? Hisashi mused, more to cover his hesitation than anything. He knew Shoyuta would tell him all about it later. "I'm fine," Shoyuta repeated, and suddenly his scarf wrapped around his injured arm, becoming a bandage as easily as it became a weapon. "Go check on your problem child." Reluctantly, Hisashi left Shoyuta to the others and ran for the control room. He paused briefly at Uraraka, but Yaoyorozu had evidently overheard their conversation and waved him on. It was some distance away, but the facility had a relatively open floor plan, so it came into view fairly quickly. Hisashi squinted as he approached, seeing that there was someone by the door. As he got closer, he could see more clearly. The figure was too tall to be Midoriya. Hisashi drew breath, ready to blast the villain into next week with his voice, but before he could shout, suddenly there was a loud thud like a door slamming, and the man crumpled to the ground. As Hisashi's strides ate up the distance, he saw the door open again, and Midoriya stepped out. He looked down at the villain, almost as though surprised that his attack had worked, but he looked up when he heard Hisashi's hurried footfalls. "Midoriya!" Hisashi cried, letting out a great rush of breath but careful not to use his quirk. Midoriya's eyes widened when he saw Hisashi, and he immediately stepped around the fallen villain to meet him. Hisashi dropped to his knees as soon as he reached Midoriya, catching the boy up in his arms and hugging him close to his chest. He squeezed tight, but Midoriya let out a little cry of pain, and Hisashi released him to see that his uniform was torn and blood-stained on one side. "Damn it!" Hisashi swore, uncaring of the little squeak of surprise Midoriya let out. He lifted the jacket and undershirt, to see 4 shallow claw marks in the boy's side. "How did this happen? Are you hurt anywhere else?" Midoriya pointed at another one of the unconscious villains littered around the floor, a larger one that looked like a panther. The claws on his right hand were blood-stained, and Hisashi fought the urge to blast an opponent already defeated into next week. "He got me before I got him," Midoriya explained simply. "They're not deep." "It still shouldn't have happened," Hisashi insisted. He had nothing to press against the wound, but thankfully it wasn't bleeding much. "None of this should have happened," Midoriya pointed out reasonably. "Really, Sensei, I'm fine." Hisashi paused, staring at the child before him. Midoriya had never called him anything but "sir" before, and this change, with nothing to mark it, seemed significant. Hisashi had been called "sensei" by many students before. Somehow this title from Midoriya's mouth meant more than all of them. It meant something entirely different. "You're very brave, lil listener," Hisashi said, instead of commenting on his change of title. "No one could have expected this much from you, but you rose to the occasion." Midoriya shrugged. "It's only what the hero students did." "You're not a hero student," Hisashi reminded him gently. The statement seemed to ring false, but if Midoriya felt so, he didn't say anything. "We all did what we had to," he insisted. Hisashi nodded. Then he stood, and placing himself beside Midoriya, he pulled the boy against his side. He did not comment on the hand fisted in the back of his jacket. If he could steady Midoriya at all, he would gladly do so. "Come on," he said, rubbing a little at the arm beneath his fingers. "Let's blow this popsicle stand." Midoriya laughed weakly, and Hisashi felt as though he might have recovered a little of his present mic charm. "So, said Shoyuta, once the rest of the staff had started to secure the villains and the class was milling around uncertainly. Which one of you can tell me what happened to Bakugo? Kirishima slowly raised his hand, looking somewhat ashamed. I left him in the fire zone, he confessed shyly. When Midoriya told us where to go, he ran off in the wrong direction. I think he's still there. Shoyuta glanced at Snipe, who finished handcuffing the villain he was standing over and then stood up to head for the fire zone. Hopefully Bakugo hadn't managed to get himself into any more trouble there. It wasn't a surprise to Shoyuta that he couldn't follow directions, even under these circumstances. They would have to do something about that. Aizawa-sensei, called Yaoyorozu, drawing Shuta's attention to where she was kneeling beside Uraraka. Shoyuta walked over to them, slow and deliberate. His legs barely wanted to obey him, and he was afraid if he moved too quickly his knees would buckle. She overused her quirk, Yaoyorozu reported, I think by a lot. She needs medical attention. Once it became clear that Uraraka wasn't going to revive with a little bit of air, Shoyuta picked the girl up and carried her towards the stairs. Yaoyorozu hovered a moment, not sure if she should still be helping, but Shoyuta shooed her off to make shock blankets for everyone. The ambulances would be here soon, and they were bound to be short. Aizawa-sensei, Uraraka said weakly, her eyes barely open as she looked up at her teacher. Rest now, Shoyuta told her as gently as he could. It's over. I tried to protect Midoriya, she told him. Her throat sounded dry. He'd have to get her some water. I tried, but he ended up protecting me. Shoyuta nearly missed a step in surprise, but managed to keep his footing. What do you mean? He asked carefully. You should have seen him, she said, a little woozy now. He took out those 3 villains like it was nothing. You were all very brave today, Shoyuta said, even as his stress-scrambled brain began once more to connect one thought with another. Midoriya had taken out villains. 3 of them at least. There might have been more after Uraraka left, or before Hizashi arrived. These might have been low-level thugs, but they were career criminals. A quirkless Gen Ed student taking out 3 of them was no joke. I'm sure Midoriya did his best, Shoyuta continued, when Uraraka didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, and he almost thought she might have been asleep when suddenly they fluttered open again. He fought like any other hero student, she said, then slumped in his arms with her head on his chest. Like any other hero student, huh? Shoyuta whispered to himself. That was certainly an interesting development. It was hard to sit through normal classes while Midoriya was off proving himself. Hitoshi hadn't thought it would be this hard. He sat at his desk, alternately trying to pay attention and gazing out the window, wondering how it was going. Midoriya's desk sat empty beside his, as though a space in the shape of his friend had been carved into his life and now stood hollow. He wondered if someone else would take that desk when Midoriya transferred, and who that someone would be. He had just decided that it would probably be some unfortunate member of the support course who he'd then have to deal with until his own transfer when a loud, blaring alarm cut through his thoughts. Level 5 security. Breach, came a voice, measured but urgent, over the PA system. All faculty are summoned to the USJ immediately. All students are dismissed. The USJ? But that was where Midoriya was. What kind of security breach was there? What kind of situation could require every single pro hero on campus at once to deal with it? Surely nothing could be so bad as to really need that many pros. They were just being overly cautious, right? The message repeated, but before it had even finished its first run through, students were talking over it, turning in their seats to face one another. Didn't we just have a security breach? Asked a boy 2 rows over from Hitoshi. Is security here really that bad? Demanded a girl near the front. Maybe it's just the press again, suggested someone who Hitoshi couldn't see in the opposite corner of the room. That was a level 3 breach, pointed out the girl just behind them. This is level 5. Hitoshi ignored them all and raised his hand. Sensei, what's going on? He called over the crowd and the alarm, without waiting to be called on. Class dismissed, was the only answer he got. Everyone collect your things and go home. Now. The rest of the class began to pack up at once, ignoring the alarm blaring overhead as their teacher bolted from the room. Hitoshi watched him go with a sense of deep unease. His gut twisted, making him want to puke, and his fingers shook as he packed his things with methodical slowness. His extremities felt strangely cold. The alarm barely registered to him as he filed outside with the others, and he felt curiously insulated from both it and the crowd around him. Once he was outside it was quieter, but he didn't join the throng heading for the main gate, leaving it even further behind. Instead he stepped to one side of the main stairs, sheltering behind the low wall flanking them, and waited. The staff, all the non-heroes who worked at UA, were shepherding students out and away from the school, but he ducked down when one of them looked at him. He wasn't going anywhere until he got some answers. "Hey," said a voice behind him, startling him as he risked a peek beyond the wall. "What the hell?" he cried, the sound only covered by the loudness of the alarm, and whirled around to see Hatsume crouching beside him. "Did Midoriya come back yet?" she asked urgently, apparently uncaring that she'd managed to surprise him. "No," Hitoshi shook his head. "He's still at the USJ, where the security breach is." "Did your teacher tell you anything?" Hatsume demanded, and Hitoshi was surprised to see she actually looked pretty worried. She hadn't previously struck him as the type to get nervous over anything. She seemed more a woman of action. "Nothing," Hitoshi informed her, watching as her look of anxiety deepened. "I don't know what to do. I'm not leaving until I find out what happened to him." "Do you have his number?" Hatsume asked. "Call him. Or text him. Something." Hitoshi took out his phone, intent on doing just that. Then suddenly he paused. If there was a security breach as serious as the alarm made it sound, then there might be something or someone genuinely dangerous at the USJ. If so, then it would probably be Midoriya's best bet to hide. What if his phone wasn't on silent? Would the sound of it going off alert someone to his presence? "I don't know." Hitoshi looked at his phone, his fingers clenched white-knuckled around it. I don't know. "Hey," said Hatsume, taking Hitoshi abruptly by the shoulders. "Midoriya's clever. He'll keep himself out of trouble, I know it, and he'll come back here when it's over. We just have to wait for him." "Right?" said Hitoshi, and took a deep breath to steady his nerves. It felt good to have a plan. "We just have to wait." After about half an hour, when all of the other students were well off campus, the alarms stopped going off. Its sudden absence was nearly as jarring as its sudden presence. Hitoshi wondered if it meant that whatever was going on was over, or if it had just stopped because there was no one left to hear it. Eventually he and Hatsume deemed it safe to come out from behind the wall and sit on the stairs. No one came to shoo them off, so they stayed there, talking quietly together. Hatsume didn't seem capable of shutting up, and Hitoshi had to admit that the small part of him that wasn't dying with worry appreciated the fact that she was willing to talk to him. So few people had been in the past. Hours passed, until the sun was low on the horizon and the sky was a hazy orange. Hitoshi agonized again and again over whether or not to call or text Midoriya. It had to be over by now, didn't it? The teachers had left ages ago. Surely it wouldn't take that many pros so long to deal with a security breach. What if Midoriya had just gone straight home from the USJ, or some alternative form of transportation had been arranged? Or maybe something happened to him, supplied an uncharitable part of his brain. "Shut up," Hitoshi whispered to himself, low enough that Hatsume couldn't hear. It didn't help. The sun had nearly gone down, purple twilight settling over the front steps of UA, when suddenly Hitoshi heard another alarm. It was distant, coming from beyond the gates, but it seemed to be getting closer. Eventually Hitoshi identified it as not an alarm, but a siren. An ambulance siren. He and Hatsume stood up as the gates parted to admit the ambulance. Hitoshi's heart was lead as he watched it pull up, and Hatsume had to tug him out of the way as it approached the steps. They stood watching, silent and transfixed, as the doors opened and a few paramedics jumped out. One of them began unfolding a ramp from the back of the ambulance, but Hitoshi could remain still no longer. "Please," he said, taking a few shaky steps toward the man. "Is there a boy in there? With green hair? He's my friend. Is he okay?" The paramedic shook his head, and a spike of terror shot through. Hitoshi. Which of his questions had he been answering? That there wasn't a boy with green hair in there? That he wasn't okay? He had to be okay. He wasn't dead at least, otherwise they wouldn't have had the siren on. Hitoshi's questions were all answered when the stretcher was pulled out. Strapped down and covered in a blanket, looking unsettlingly pale and drawn, was a girl with short brown hair. He knew it wasn't particularly becoming of him, given that she was obviously still injured, but he couldn't help the relief that spread through him. Behind him he heard Hatsume release a breath. Apparently she didn't have any more decency than him. "Where are the rest of the students?" Hitoshi asked the paramedic, but he was already lifting one end of the stretcher and preparing to carry it up the steps to the door. Hatsume put a hand on Hitoshi's shoulder and pulled him back, and they resumed their position on the stairs. Now that Hitoshi knew that something dire had indeed happened, he found it even harder not to worry. It had to be over if they were sending people away in ambulances, didn't it? Surely it was safe to call Midoriya now? He hadn't quite managed to convince himself of this when suddenly Hatsume shoved at his shoulder to get his attention. He looked up to see her pointing at the gate, where 2 buses were currently being admitted. The 2 of them ran forward again as the first one stopped and began disgorging students. Some of the hero students looked at them curiously, but Hitoshi didn't care about them as he watched more and more people get off the bus. He felt like he was about to vibrate out his skin as he watched a boy in plate armor come out, followed by a girl with long fleshy wires dangling from her ears, and then suddenly Midoriya was coming into view on the stairs. He was just turning away from the person behind him, his eyes going to the ambulance as he stepped onto solid ground. Hitoshi didn't think. He immediately ran forward and didn't so much go up to as collide with Midoriya, catching the smaller boy up in his arms and hugging him tight. "Mido!" he cried, squeezing so vigorously Midoriya was nearly lifted off his feet. "Shin-chan!" Midoriya replied, sounding surprised and oddly out of breath. "Are you okay?" Hitoshi demanded, pulling away from Midoriya to hold him at arm's length and give him a quick once-over. "The heroes all left, and we were told to just go home, but they didn't give us any information about what had happened, and then an ambulance arrived and oh my god, is that blood?" There was, in fact, blood on Midoriya's jacket, staining the edges of 3 large slashes like claw marks in the fabric. It wasn't a lot, clearly they hadn't bled very much, but the sight of the dark stains made Hitoshi's heart clench painfully anyway. He turned Midoriya to the side and pulled up his shirt and jacket, to find a large pad of gauze taped over the area beneath the slash marks. "I'm fine," Midoriya insisted as Hitoshi examined. "The cuts aren't deep. What are you doing here?" Hitoshi looked up at him, eyes wide and blinking rapidly. He opened his mouth to ask, to demand Midoriya tell him why they wouldn't be here, why they wouldn't have waited for him, but before he could speak suddenly something over Midoriya's shoulder caught his attention. Students were getting off the other bus, most of them glancing at the scene they were making without pausing, but one boy had stepped off to one side and stopped. He had a very strange appearance, with half his hair red and the other half white, one gray eye and one blue, and a prominent burn scar across half his face. He was staring at Midoriya with an unreadable expression. Hitoshi met his eye, his grip on Midoriya tightening. "Waiting for you, Green Bean," said Hatsume, covering Hitoshi's distraction. "You didn't think we'd just leave without making sure you were all right, did you?" "I hadn't thought about it," Midoriya replied, making Hitoshi turn back to him. It was just like Midoriya to honestly not have considered that anyone would wait for him. "What happened?" Hitoshi asked. He found as he did so that he had to fight the urge to touch Midoriya's hair, to brush some of it out of his face, even though it wasn't long enough to hang in his eyes. "We got attacked by a bunch of villains," said a new voice, striking Hitoshi with how strangely chipper it was. He looked up to see a boy with spiky red hair and no shirt on the stairs of the bus behind Midoriya. He was smiling with a mouthful of very sharp teeth, and he didn't look at all worse for where it being caught in such an attack. Immediately Hitoshi went on the defensive. Did he think this was some kind of game? Someone had gotten hurt. Was this playtime for him, while civilians came away bloodied? Abruptly Midoriya took Hitoshi by the arm and towed him back towards Hatsume, letting the sharp-toothed boy step off the bus. Behind him came a girl with pink skin and 2 small horns amid her equally pink hair. Hitoshi regarded them both with suspicion, then suddenly remembered the boy with the 2-toned hair. He looked back, but the boy was gone. Who are your friends, Midoriya? Asked the pink girl. Inexplicably, this made Hitoshi's skin crawl, but Midoriya was gripping him tightly by the arm, so he swallowed his indignation. Oh! Midoriya gasped, as though only just realizing he would be called upon to give introductions. These are my friends, Hitoshi Shinso, from Gen Ed with me, and Mei Hatsume of the support course. Hatsume gave a little wave. Hitoshi, still feeling supremely uncomfortable, nodded slightly. Neither of the hero students seemed to find this odd, and simply smiled cheerfully back. Guys, this is Mina Ishido and Aijiro Kirishima, and Tsu Azui. Midoriya finished as a girl with enormous eyes and her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth joined their little group. Call me Tsu, she instructed politely. Midoriya paused as though unsure. How to name the relationship between himself and the hero students. At last he settled on, they've been very nice to me. Neat goggles, Hatsume said, looking interestedly at the pair of almost frog-like goggles atop Azui's head. She did not seem to be at all wary of the hero students, but Hitoshi still felt they were being far too casual about this whole thing. The red-haired boy Kirishima turned to him. You should be proud of your friend, he said, showing off his teeth in a bright, if slightly intimidating smile. He was super brave. He stayed to help us, and he probably got all of us out of there alive. Ishido chimed in, with what Hitoshi would almost consider appropriate sheepishness. It was really impressive, Ribbit, said Azui, doing nothing to decrease Hitoshi's impression of a frog. Hitoshi took a deep, careful breath. He still didn't quite like the way the hero students were in such good spirits after a near-death experience, especially one from which not everyone had come away unscathed. Still, they at least seemed to appreciate Midoriya and acknowledge how impressive Hitoshi's friend really was. If they had been willing to sweep his injury and his contributions under the rug, Hitoshi didn't think he could have avoided taking a swing at one of them. At last Hitoshi put his hands in his pockets, trying to let the hand Midoriya still had gripped around his arm feel him relax a little. Doesn't surprise me, he said, as nonchalantly as possible. Mido's just like that. Not, said Midoriya quietly, his head ducked down. R2, said Hitoshi, and was gratified to hear Hatsume's voice in chorus with his own. Midoriya blushed but said nothing. Ishido smiled benevolently at Midoriya, catching his eye deliberately when he risked a peek upwards. You sure you don't want someone to walk you home, sweetie? She asked, and Hitoshi was surprised to find she didn't sound mocking at all. The offer was, apparently, genuine. I can walk Mido home, Hitoshi said before Midoriya could answer. He'd intended to do so anyway, and had texted his mom to make sure she knew he'd be late. Kirishima looked worried. But a hero student should dash, he began, but unexpectedly it was Midoriya who interrupted him. Shinshin's going to be a hero student. Midoriya insisted, eyes bright and eager as he talked about Hitoshi. He's going to get in through the sports festival. He's really skilled, and his quirk is dash. Mido! Hitoshi hissed, and Midoriya stopped talking. Hitoshi wasn't sure what expression Midoriya was wearing, as he himself was looking determinedly at the ground. His cheeks felt hot. He couldn't remember being talked up to someone important like that by anyone, ever. It felt good but also mortifying. There was a pause, and then a hand clapped against Hitoshi's shoulder. We'll leave it to you then, Kirishima said, making Hitoshi look up into his grinning face. Like with Ishido, there was no trace of mocking, only genuine trust and confidence. Kirishima squeezed Hitoshi's shoulder once, then turned and led the way back inside. Azui followed without comment, and Ishido gave a little wave before going too. Hitoshi stared after them, dumbfounded. Nothing about that encounter had gone as he would have predicted. Hero students are nothing like I imagined, he said, once he, Midoriya and Hatsume were alone. Tell me about it, Midoriya sighed. Everyone had the next day off. Even though only one class of hero students had technically been caught in the attack, both hero classes as well as the support, business and gen ed courses were all given time to recover from the shock. On Wednesday though it was back to school, and Izuku met Shinso at the gate on their way to their normal classroom at their normal time. Apart from the communication that there would be a rest day, Izuku hadn't heard anything from the administration about the results of his test. If they don't let you into the support course after that, sue them, Shinso said menacingly as they made their way through the halls. To be fair, I didn't give a lot of performance notes, Izuku defended. He didn't even know what the verdict would be yet, but he was already prepared for the worst. They wanted you to prove yourself, Shinso argued. You've proved yourself a whole hell of a lot more than they could have asked for. If they deny you on a technicality, I'll fight Principal Nezu myself. Please don't say things like that, Izuku ummed as they reached the classroom. As soon as they were inside, Izuku found another hall pass being waved in his face. Midoriya, you're wanted in the principal's office again, said their teacher as Izuku took the piece of paper from him. Bring your things. Izuku didn't know what bring your things meant in terms of his transfer, but Shinso sent him a conspiratorial grin, so he decided to take it as a good sign. The door to Principal Nezu's office was as big and imposing as ever. Izuku took a deep breath before raising a hand to push it open, but just like last time it opened for him, without his even needing to touch it. Izuku looked in wonderment at the scene beyond, not daring to set foot inside just yet. In the office was not only Nezu, sitting in the same chair where he'd been seated last time, but also Eraserhead and Present Mike standing to either side of him. They were all looking at Izuku with friendly expressions. Nezu's smug contentedness, Eraser's subdued benevolence, and Mike's enthusiastic excitement. Izuku nearly walked inside without taking in the rest of the room, but before he could cross the threshold he saw that there were 2 chairs across from Nezu instead of one like last time. One of the chairs was empty. Sitting in the other was Kaken. As soon as Kaken's eyes lit on Izuku they filled with white-hot rage. "Demon nerd, I'll kill ya," he shouted, leaping out of his seat with hands popping like sparklers, but before he could take a single step suddenly strips of white cloth were wrapping around him, binding him to his chair. "I'd be quiet if I were you," Eraser said ominously, eyes red as he glared at Kaken. "You're in enough trouble already." Kaken growled, but his quirk was useless under Eraserhead's gaze, and eventually he slouched into the chair and was released. He turned away from Izuku to face Principal Nezu, murderous rage apparently quelled. "What's he doing here?" Kaken spat. "He's got nothing to do with my attitude, or whatever excuse you're finding to get me in trouble." "Midoriya, please come in and sit down," Nezu said, beckoning Izuku inside with one paw. Izuku hesitated. "I can come back?" "No, this meeting is about you," said Nezu, still smiling placidly at him. "You're not the one in trouble, lil listener," said Mike jovially, flashing a 1,000-watt smile that made Izuku feel just a little bit calmer. On shaky legs Izuku made his way inside, closing the door behind himself. He sat in the chair beside Kaken, trying not to look at the other boy, or feel the way his eyes were burning a hole in the side of his head. "Now, I'm sure you've been awaiting the results of your support course entrance exam with bated breath," Nezu said brightly. "Yes, sir," Izuku admitted. It had seemed so natural to speak firmly and clearly when he was in the control room. Here it sounded like his voice was ready to shatter at any moment. "I'm pleased to inform you that you passed," Nezu chirped. "You will, if you so desire, be immediately transferred to the support course. Power Loader is very eager to have an analyst in his class. It's been a few years since our last one, and she's gone on to a very promising career as a performance analyst working directly for the Hero Public Safety Commission." Izuku's eyes went wide. A performance analyst? He'd never heard of the position, but it sounded like just the kind of thing he was good at. Analyzing heroes was something he was confident in, something he'd practiced. If he could just... However, Nezu's voice cut through Izuku's thoughts. "I would like to offer you the chance at an alternative." "An alternative?" Izuku asked blankly. He had no idea what kind of alternative could be better than something like that. "Indeed," Nezu said, and there was a strange quality to his voice that made Izuku's heartbeat quicken, as though danger were present. "I want to offer you the chance to join the hero course." Izuku blinked. He had to have misheard that. "What?" he asked blankly. Nezu's smile widened. "I told you when last we spoke that I had been hearing about you non-stop from several people I respect," he explained. "I was hearing not only about your intelligence, but your physical abilities, your combat capabilities, and your strategic mind. I must say, I was impressed with you long before I saw the videos from the USJ attack. You were? Izuku asked, his head reeling, his heart threatening to burst. I was, Nezu confirmed. In fact, I was so impressed that I had already begun to consider this option before I ever sent you to the USJ. It was only your lack of enthusiasm that held me back, but I would be a fool not to at least offer someone with your potential a chance at the hero course. But I don't have a quirk, Izuku protested, the only thought that would stay together in his head. He couldn't be a hero if he didn't have a quirk. Surely Nezu was. Are you kidding me? Exploded Kaken, abruptly reminding Izuku that he was right there beside him. Deku can't be a hero, he's just a defenseless little weakling. He'd curl up and die if he were put in a fight against a real hero. If that is your position, you will be given a chance to prove it, Nezu informed him calmly. Both Izuku and Kaken stared at him. What the hell? Kaken demanded. I'll prove it right now, just dash. That brings me to the issue of you, Nezu interrupted, and Kaken fell silent. I have also been hearing about you with a degree of regularity over the past few weeks. You seemed at first glance to have even more potential than Midoriya, but thus far your performance in your heroics lessons has been very poor indeed. Not my fault we have to hold back so much, Kaken argued. If you'd let me go all out, I'd show you. It is your failure to rein yourself in adequately that is hindering you, Nezu countered, with a slight emphasis on the word failure that Izuku heard Kaken growl at. Your refusal to follow instructions, penchant for wanton destruction, consistent brutality against other students, as well as a few other accusations dash. That's the kind of stuff D-listers who can't cut it have to worry about. Kaken protested. I'm going to be number one, no one will notice any of that stuff about me. I assure you they will, Nezu said, and while his demeanor remained placid in the face of Kaken's anger, Izuku could see he was getting a little tired of being interrupted. Yeah, right, Kaken scoffed, throwing himself against the back of his chair. When it became clear Kaken wasn't going to protest any further, Nezu went on. Placed in the context of the recent attack on a UA facility, both your situations have been thrown into stark relief. Midoriya, your efforts were instrumental in repelling the attack, and for that we are grateful. Diamond Biester didn't even fight any villains, Kaken huffed, but for once he didn't shout. Izuku felt it prudent not to correct him, and instead focused on Nezu's words. Bakugo, we would never dream of disciplining a student for their behavior under such dire circumstances, Nezu said, voice strangely tight and stiff. However, the incident has drawn attention to how some of your attitude problems can become exponentially bigger concerns when combined with real danger. I believe I have a solution. If you think this little weakling could ever be of any use to me or anyone, you've got another thing dash, Kaken began at a shout, but fell silent when he was interrupted. We will hold an official exam match, interjected Nezu, between Midoriya and Bakugo. The winner will be admitted to the hero course, and the loser will become a member of the Gen Ed course. There was silence for a moment, and Izuku took advantage of it to try and force the idea through his brain. He could get into the hero course. He had the chance to get into the hero course. To do it, he'd have to defeat Kaken. He would have to fight Kaken and win. If he won, and that was a big if, it would ruin Kaken's chances of becoming a hero, or at least set them back significantly. He would be standing in the way of a future hero, a truly great one at that. But then again, if what Nezu said was true, wasn't Kaken standing in his own way? Izuku reflexively glanced over at Kaken, lost in his own musings and expecting to find Kaken frozen with indignation. Instead, when he turned to the other boy, he found Kaken looking at him, a wide, cruel smile stretching his face and narrowing his eyes. A shiver ran down Izuku's spine at that look, familiar as it was from their middle school days. It was a look that said he was in for a world of pain. Deal, said Kaken, voice low and rough from shouting. It would be up to you, Midoriya, said Nezu, before Izuku could answer. You don't have to agree to the arrangement, and indeed you may not want to. I'm not in the habit of allowing students to jump from course to course. If you do this, you forfeit your chance at the support course. If you lose, you go back to Gen Ed. Izuku stared at Nezu, at his calm, friendly smile. He was desperate for a hint at what he should do, but Nezu betrayed nothing. Izuku looked at Eraserhead, but he was still glaring disapprovingly at Kaken, not even paying attention to Izuku or his decision. He glanced over at Present Mike to find him smiling encouragingly, but with that same deliberateness he'd noticed during their discussion at the gym, and Izuku couldn't pick apart what it meant. "What's the matter, Deku?" asked Kaken meanly. "Scared." Of course he was scared. This had to be the biggest decision of his life, something that would alter his future forever. He was supposed to make it right now? He thought of what everyone had said about him over the last week, about how good his analysis was, about how useful it would be to heroes if he became a professional analyst. He thought about why he had started his analysis, how badly he'd wanted to be a hero for so long. He thought about how it had felt when the doctor had told him he would never have a quirk, and how his mother had held him and cried when he'd said he would still be a hero. Izuku stood up from his chair and bent stiffly at the waist in a formal bow. "Principal Nezu," Izuku said slowly. "Thank you very much for this opportunity. I agreed to the exam match as a means of testing whether I'm worthy of the hero course. I promise to do my best." He looked up, to find Nezu smiling a wide, nearly manic smile. "Excellent. So when's the match going to be?" Shinso asked as they did their warm-up stretches. "End of next week," Izuku said, voice strained as he leaned into a particularly hard stretch. His muscles were extremely tense today. "We'll do that instead of the heroics lesson next Friday." "Less than 2 weeks to prepare," Shinso said grimly. "That's not much time." "It'll have to be enough," Izuku said, trying to swallow his anxiety. "Everything's riding on this, I can't afford to lose." "I'm just glad you finally believe in yourself," Shinso said with a slight laugh. Izuku turned to him, mid-stretch. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I hadn't even been considering trying for the hero course before now dash." "Exactly," Shinso interrupted. He stood up from his stretch and looked at Izuku, his gaze warm and fond. "Before this you didn't even think you could try to be a hero. I'm glad you're finally ready to fight for your dream." "But, the support course dash," Izuku began, also straightening, but before he could finish Shinso was shaking his head. "That was never what you wanted," he said. "Not really. You were settling. I'm glad you're not willing to settle anymore." Izuku smiled, feeling tears prickling at his eyes. He hadn't needed to tell Shinso how badly he'd wanted to be a hero. Shinso had seen. He'd noticed, and what was more he'd cared enough to notice. He was willing to support Izuku in chasing that dream, and Izuku was suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude to have such a friend. "Thank you, Shinchan," Izuku said, voice quavering with barely suppressed emotion. He didn't want to start crying right now. Shinso shrugged. "Not that big a deal." Izuku opened his mouth to say that it was a big deal, to tell Shinso how much he appreciated him, when suddenly the door to the gym burst open. Shinso and Izuku turned, to see a whole crowd of people flooding in. It took him a second to register who they were, but then he realized they were all members of Class 1A. In fact, it was most of Class 1A. "Midoriya," called Uraraka from the front, waving as she led the parade of students into the gym. "Fancy meeting you here." "Uraraka," Izuku called back. "You're looking much better today. Did you guys want to use this gym? We can move dash." "No, silly," Uraraka said, grinning from ear to ear. "We're here to help you train." Izuku stared at her, mouth open. "What?" "We all discussed it as a class," said Ida, stepping forward and adjusting his glasses. "We decided it's simply unfair that Bakugo has had weeks of hero training and you haven't, and yet you will be expected to compete as equals. You would be at a decided disadvantage going in, so we're here to help you prepare. We're going to give you a crash course in heroics," Kaminari said with a grin. "Everything we've learned since the beginning of the year. Of course it would also be unfair for us to help you train while Bakugo trained alone," Ida said, making an odd chopping motion with his hand. "So Yaoyorozu and Kirishima have kindly offered to train with him while the rest of us train you. I believe this distribution of resources will result in as equal a competition as possible." "Are you serious?" Izuku asks, his voice high and fragile as his heart swelled with emotion. "You'd really do that for me?" "Of course," Uraraka said brightly, giving Izuku a thumbs up. After what you did for us, it's the least we can do. Izuku felt that he had done pretty well to get through the entire USJ incident without crying in front of any heroes or hero students. This gesture, however, completely obliterated his control. Tears immediately spilled from his eyes, pouring down his cheeks in a tide his rapid blinking couldn't possibly stem. He wiped at the rivulets with his bare wrist, then lifted the neck of his shirt and buried his face in it. Once he felt confident enough to speak, he emerged from the safety of his shirt to look at the collection of hero students. "Thank you," he said, voice high and tinny as he tried to keep control of himself. "Every single one of you has been so kind to me. I don't know how I could ever repay any of you." Uraraka stepped forward and placed her hand on Izuku's shoulder. Then suddenly her face, previously open and friendly, radiating warmth and optimism, took on a deadly serious expression. It was as though a shadow passed over her, and beneath its darkness she looked as terrifying as any villain. "Just beat that little punk," she said, voice a low growl, then suddenly her bright, happy smile was back. "Okay." Izuku swallowed. "Okay." Aijuru really didn't blame Yaoyorozu for backing out. When the class decided to help Midoriya train, Ida had agonized over what they could do to make the competition most fair. The rest of the class didn't seem to particularly care what was fair, beyond what they told Yamada-sensei to get him to look in the computer system and find out where Midoriya was training. Ida, however, had worked himself into a lather over it, so Yaoyorozu had suggested that if one of the class representatives trained with Bakugo and one with Midoriya, then it would be as fair as it could be. "An excellent notion, class president," Ida praised, hands waving in jerky emphasis. "Just the kind of clever thinking I would expect from our class's elected leader. Of course, if you would prefer to train with Midoriya, I will dutifully train with Bakugo dash." No, Yaoyorozu smiled beatifically. "Please, Ida, I know you didn't get much chance to talk to Midoriya that day, and it was something you wanted to do. You go with the group that's going to train Midoriya, and I'll help Bakugo prepare." "You're too kind," Ida said emphatically. "I will lead the group that is to train with Midoriya to the best of my ability. Now, who would like to come with me?" The answer to that question seemed to be the whole class, which presented a new problem for the meticulous Ida. "We can't all train with Midoriya," Ida protested. As the rest of the class all nodded their agreement to each other. "It wouldn't be fair. It's not very fair that Bakugo has the class president to train him but Midoriya has the vice president," pointed out Ishido reasonably. Ida immediately leaned his head against the wall in shame. "You're right," he said in an anguished voice. "At the end of the day, I am only the vice president. It wouldn't be fair to Midoriya. I will train with Bakugo dash." No. Yaoyorozu piped up again, smile taking on a strained quality. "I think if Midoriya has more people to train him then it balances out pretty well actually. I'll go with Yaoyorozu." Mineta volunteered eagerly, but was immediately overruled by the other girls and quickly disappeared into the crowd with Tsu's tongue wrapped around his waist. Ida still looked torn, so Aijuru raised a hand. "I'll train with Bakugo," he said cheerfully. "Between me and Yaoyorozu I think we'll do pretty well, and the rest of you can help Midoriya." After a bit more consideration, Ida deemed this an acceptable solution, and the class took off to the gym where Midoriya and his friend from Gen Ed were training. Mineta was nowhere to be seen, so Aijuru assumed it would just be him and Yaoyorozu, but rather than pulling out her gym clothes she began putting away her things as soon as the rest of the class had left. "Aren't we going to help Bakugo?" Aijuru asked as she shouldered her bag and stood up from her desk. "You can if you want," Yaoyorozu said, in a bored tone of voice. "I'm going home." "But we told Ida." Aijuru trailed off as Yaoyorozu gave him a condescending look. "I just said that so Ida would feel better about going to help Midoriya," she said disdainfully. "Do you think Bakugo would really thank us even if we did offer to help him train? He'd probably blow us up as soon as talk to us, let alone let us help. Still, it doesn't seem very manly to give him no support at all," Aijuru protested, but even as he said it he couldn't help thinking that she was right. Yaoyorozu rolled her eyes. "Like I said, go if you want." Bakugo was already long gone by the time the others left, and Yamada-sensei had also vanished, so there was no one Aijiro could ask which gym Bakugo was training at. He decided to leave it for today and try tomorrow, but the next day he got so caught up in the excitement of everyone talking about Midoriya's progress that Bakugo slipped away again. This time he was able to ask Yamada-sensei to check which gym he was in, but apparently Bakugo wasn't in a gym, or at least not yet, and then Yamada-sensei had to leave. The next day was Friday, and Aijiro was determined to join in Bakugo's training today. He tried to talk to him a few times throughout classes, but was always ignored, and by day's end he'd realized he would have to be sneaky about this. When Bakugo left the classroom ahead of everyone else, this time Aijiro was only a few yards behind him. He followed Bakugo. Not to a gym, but to one of the fake sections of city that they used for urban combat training, and he could hear the explosions before he even entered the building where Bakugo was training on the roof. "Hey bro," he called, standing prudently by the rooftop door instead of walking immediately up to Bakugo. "How's it hanging? Get lost, shitty hair." Bakugo snapped, without even turning around. He had a pile of rocks next to him, and as Aijiro watched he picked one up and threw it off the roof, putting a little of his quirk behind it as he did so. It sailed high in the air, coming down somewhere close to the outer wall. Aijiro looked dubiously at the pile. "You know you won't be allowed to bring anything into the arena, right?" he said. Midoriya told the others Nezu forbids support items. "I don't need a support item to make rubble," Bakugo growled, picking up another rock. "And I sure as hell don't need any help to beat Deku." "I just figured you might want a training buddy," Aijiro suggested carefully. "You had to be gentle with Bakugo, as with all live explosives." "I don't need your help." Bakugo snarled, whirling around and throwing the rock in his hand at Aijiro. Aijiro hardened just in time. This throw had even more explosive power behind it than the last, and the rock shattered into dust as it hit Aijiro's unbreakable skin. "Watch it," Aijiro said waspishly. "You could really hurt someone like that, you know." Bakugo scoffed and turned his back on Aijiro once more. "That's the FING point, hair for brains. I'm just trying to help." Aijiro snapped, then stopped and took a deep breath. He wouldn't get anywhere by shouting. "Look, the entire rest of the class is helping Midoriya. I just figured it'd be a little more fair if you had someone to train with too." Bakugo picked up another rock and hucked it, screaming, "Die!" as he did so and putting still more of his quirk behind the throw. This time the rock made it all the way to the outer wall, but bounced off the inside instead of going over. As Aijiro watched the rock fall, Bakugo began to speak. "Deku can have as many unfair advantages as he wants," he spat. "He can train however he wants, wherever he wants, with whoever he wants. It won't make any difference. He's a weakling, a nobody, a pebble in my path to greatness. I'll beat him no matter what he does, and I'll do it by myself." Aijiro considered this for a moment. He could stay, he supposed. He could stand there arguing until he was blue in the face. He could try and get Bakugo to see the merits of training with others, how much of an advantage Midoriya had and how much of an edge he was turning away. He could just attack Bakugo, like Bakugo had attacked him, and try and force him into a sparring match that way. Or he could not do any of that. Instead he turned and headed back down the stairs, then out of the training grounds and back to the main campus. He walked halfway across school grounds to the isolated gym the others had mentioned Midoriya using, noteworthy only for how little it was used by anyone else. He swiped his ID card to get in and walked into the main floor, where the rest of Class 1A was shouting and cheering. For a moment he stood in the doorway watching, the door propped open by his shoulder. Jiru noticed him first, quieting when she saw him standing in the doorway. Beside her, Kaminari turned when he heard her fall silent, and he too stopped shouting when he noticed Aijiro. Silence overtook the class in a slow wave, finally reaching the place on the training mat where Midoriya and Shiro were squaring off. Midoriya looked over only when Shiro had already taken his attention off the match. "Kirishima?" he asked tentatively, looking confused. It was clear that the others had told him where Aijiro and Yaoyorozu were supposed to be. Aijiro sighed. "Got room for one more at Midoriya's training?" he asked wearily. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then from the other side of the training mat Uraraka jumped a little higher than should be possible, hovering in the air to be seen above the others. "Of course," she said excitedly. "You want the next spar?" Aijiro gave a tired little smile. Sure, he said, and came further into the room, letting the door fall closed behind him. The hero students were as good as their word, and a week and 2 days passed quicker than Izuku would have thought possible. He would go to class in the Gen Ed course, paying attention as best he could while his mind was on the other side of campus. Then, when the school day was over, he would meet his friends, and he did think he could call them friends now at their usual gym for his specially formulated workout routine. It was altered somewhat to incorporate their advice, the things they'd learned about improving certain skills in their heroics class. Much of it was things Izuku had figured out himself, but there were a few ideas that came only with experience, and each time one of Class 1A mentioned something he hadn't considered, they seemed to glow with pride. "You're pretty clever about training Midoriya," said Hagakure as he scribbled down notes, mentally making room in his routine for the new information. "It's no wonder you've come so far on your own. I just analyzed the moves that were most common in the fighting styles I want to emulate and determined what skills are necessary to pull them off," he said distractedly. "It's not hard to isolate the muscles groups you need, and flexibility training is pretty easy as long as you do it consistently. Beyond that, specialty skills just require repetition and persistence." Hagakure giggled, and Izuku realized he'd been mumbling. He was about to apologize, but he remembered what Hatsume had said about it not being as creepy as he'd thought, so he swallowed it and returned what he assumed was her smile. The hero students weren't the only ones helping him train. Shinso was there every day listening dutifully to the hero students' input and doing the modified routine alongside him. Izuku felt good that Shinso was able to benefit from all this attention as well, and he knew Shinso was happy for the help. He had been a little worried that Shinso would be uncomfortable with all the hero students around, but Shinso assured him that this would be good for both of them, and when Izuku thanked him for his help he smiled so brightly it banished all Izuku's fears. He did sometimes catch his friend shooting strange, unfriendly looks at Uraraka when he didn't think anyone was looking, but then Shinso would look at him with that beautiful smile again and Izuku would get a strange feeling in his stomach that derailed his thoughts entirely. Hatsume also stopped by training a few times. On Izuku's advice she had taken to carrying a notebook as well, to jot down stray ideas, and she used it to take notes as she watched him spar. She had been particularly disappointed to find out he was not allowed to bring support items into this match, but her good spirits had quickly returned with whatever idea had her taking such fervent notes. "What are you writing down?" Izuku asked the first time he'd finished about to find her scribbling madly in her notebook. "You'll see," she replied with her trademark manic grin. "I can't even have a hint?" Izuku wheedled playfully. It was getting easier to be playful with his friends these days. "When you get into the hero course, I'll show you what I'm working on," she said cryptically, and would say no more than that. They decided early on that the hero students would use their quirks during practice bouts. There was no point in them holding back. Kaken certainly would not. It was good practice in outmaneuvering his opponents, and with each victory he felt less like it was luck and more like he'd been genuinely clever. Still, he had to prepare specifically for a fight with Kaken, and he already knew all about Kaken's quirk. The trick was learning to fight against it, which was easier said than done. None of them had quirks quite as flashy as Kaken's, but Kaminari's made getting close to his hands equally unwise and Ishido had a similar range. The person with the closest quirk to Kaken's was Todoroki, but he mostly hung back. At first Izuku thought the others might have forced him to come, and he didn't really want to be there, but then he noticed how closely Todoroki was observing and the frustrated look on his normally stoic face. Clearly Todoroki was interested. Izuku just wasn't sure in what. Again Izuku noticed Shinso giving sidelong looks at Todoroki this time, but he said nothing about Todoroki's odd behavior and Todoroki seemed content not to speak either. Izuku was so caught up in training, in making sure everyone knew he appreciated their efforts, in focusing on how he was going to approach the fight, that for a while he almost forgot to be nervous. As days passed and the match drew nearer, however, the enormity of what he was about to do somehow became more real. A tightness settled around his chest like a steel band, making it more and more difficult to breathe easily, and it only grew more vice-like when he was alone. In quiet moments, when everyone else had gone, he sometimes felt so oxygen-starved the room would start to spin. It was during one of those quiet moments that he broke down. It was Thursday, the day before the match, and Izuku was the last out of the gym. He'd gotten that dizzy feeling as the other boys were changing out of their gym clothes, and he'd had to take a minute to himself before he could follow suit. They were all gone by the time he stepped out of the changing room, but instead of his schoolmates he found a teacher waiting for him outside. "How's it, Hanjin, lil listener?" Present Mike greeted, beaming down at Izuku. "Seems like you've been hard at work prepping for your big debut." "Yeah," Izuku said wearily. "Everyone's been so great helping me, but all this training is really wearing me out." "Better make sure you're getting enough rest," Mike warned. "Downtime is important for any hero. You'll have more time to chillax when you aren't rehearsing for a big show." "I guess," Izuku said, trying to muster a smile for his teacher. Mick's expression changed though, settling into something gentler, more sympathetic than his usual bright enthusiasm. "It's not just training though," he surmised. "Worrying takes a lot out of you too." Izuku looked away, off to one side. "Is it that obvious how scared I am?" he asked in a small voice. "Anyone would be scared," Mike pointed out. "You've got a lot riding on this fight." "I know," Izuku said, "but everyone else just seems so confident. None of them seem worried that they won't be good enough, or that something will go wrong and they'll lose everything, or dash. They've already been admitted to the hero course," Mike reminded him. "They've had a lifetime of encouragement because of their quirks. I don't imagine you've had much encouragement at all." Izuku looked at the floor, then shook his head briefly. He did not want to look at present Mike as he admitted that his life hadn't exactly been full of people willing to place their confidence in him. A large, warm hand landed on Izuku's shoulder, but still he couldn't bring himself to look up. "What's on your mind, lil listener?" Mike asked softly. "I just dash," Izuku began, and suddenly there they were, the tears he'd been suppressing for days now, flowing from his eyes to drip down his cheeks and onto the tile floor. He dashed at them with both hands and went on. "It's a lot, you know? Everyone has so much faith in me, and it's new, and it feels good, and I don't want it to go away. I just don't want to let everyone down." "You won't let us down, lil listener," Mike insisted, and then suddenly he was right there, kneeling in front of Izuku and knocking his hands away from his face, cupping his cheeks and wiping at the tears with both thumbs. "You couldn't possibly let us down, after everything you've already accomplished." "But what if I do?" Izuku sobbed, looking up at last into Mick's concerned face. "What if I can't do it? The more I think about it, the more I don't think I can, and dash." "You can do it," Mike cut him off. He didn't speak loudly, but his voice was firm, solid as steel, like he was as sure as stone of his conclusion. "How do you know?" Izuku asked desperately. He felt strangely untethered from his body, but Mick's thumbs stroking the skin beneath his eyes lessened the feeling. "I wouldn't have recommended the match if I didn't believe you could do it," Mike said, smiling down at Izuku with eyes twinkling behind his shades. Izuku sniffled. "Really?" he asked shakily. Mike chuckled a little. "Really?" he confirmed, then rested his forehead against Izuku's. For a moment Izuku just breathed. The steady pressure of his teacher's head against his own seemed to push him down into himself, stopping his mind from carrying him away on the breeze. He could smell the leather of Mick's fingerless gloves, and hear his steady breathing. He almost thought he could feel his heartbeat through the places they were connected, but he was sure that was just his own. "Okay," he breathed, nodding a little, careful not to dislodge anything. "Okay. I believe you." "Good," said Mike softly, pulling back and giving Izuku one of his rare, genuine smiles. "For a second there I thought I was going to have to call Aizawa to knock some sense into you." Izuku giggled wetly. "Yeah," he said, nodding in exaggerated agreement. "Let's not do that." Finally Friday arrived, and Izuku walked into his morning classes completely on autopilot. His mind was entirely elsewhere, in the training grounds where they would have the exam fight, and he barely registered his surroundings as he made his way to his desk. It was only when he felt someone tap him lightly on the shoulder that he was recalled to himself, and he whirled around to see one of the girls in class standing behind him. She sat 2 rows away, and she and Izuku had only spoken a few times, but her smile was open and friendly. "Hey," she said with a nervous little wave. "Midoriya, right?" "Yeah," he replied. "I think we met on the first day of class." "Fujioka," isn't it? Yeah, she said, apparently pleased to be remembered. I, just wanted to say, well, that is, some of us have heard. You know about my exam fight today? Izuku guessed. Yeah, Fujioka sighed in relief. Anyway, I just wanted to say good luck. Oh. Izuku gaped for a moment before recovering himself. Thank you. That's really sweet. I heard you don't have a quirk, she went on. Well, neither does my little sister. I just thought if you win, well, it'd really be something to tell her, you know? Izuku hesitated a moment, then gave her a wide grin. I guess I'll just have to win then. That's the spirit, said a male voice from behind Fujioka, and Izuku looked around her to see a boy he'd never even spoken to giving him a thumbs up. There was a general murmur from all through the room, and Izuku looked around to see nearly every student in class looking at him. Some were smiling, some giving him looks of fierce determination, and a few were making fighting gestures like flexing or punching the air. None of them, however, were giving him looks of scorn, and none of them were laughing at him. Izuku looked over at Shinso, to see him grinning wide and genuine. He looked back at the class. Thank you all, he said with a small bow. I promise to do my best to live up to your expectations. There was a round of cautious, subdued cheering, like a celebration of fragile hope, before their teacher walked in and called the class to order. To Izuku's relief, Shinso and Hatsume were excused from class to watch the exam match. Not that you'll have any shortage of cheering fans. Present Mike said as he stood over their congregation at lunch, holding out 2 hall passes and beaming broadly. You've made quite an impression on Class 1A, but I figure it'd be nice to have someone from your own class in the crowd. As Shinso and Hatsume took the hall passes, Izuku looked up at Mike with watery eyes. He had managed not to cry at Class 1C's vote of confidence, but he was almost sure that wouldn't last the day. No matter the outcome of the match, he was bound to shed a few tears. Thank you, Izuku said, blinking rapidly to clear his vision. I didn't, thank you. Mike gave the most exaggerated wink he'd ever seen. No problem, lil listener. Thanks, Shinso concurred, examining his hall pass interestedly. Then he asked in a breath. You're using the stadium? Like, the one used for the sports festival? Of course. Mike insisted loudly. This is an official exam match, which means we're using an official exam facility and official exam rules. Not to mention an official exam announcer. He gestured at himself demonstratively, and Izuku's eyes widened. You're going to be announcing the match? Like, giving commentary? Just a heads up, Mike said, leaning and shielding his mouth from the side with one hand. I'll have to be impartial, so don't get discouraged if it doesn't seem like I want you to win. I understand, Izuku nodded seriously. Thank you for coming to give us the passes. Mike struck a pose and gave them double finger guns, then went on his way. He seems really cool, Hatsume said as she chewed a bite of rice. A little goofy, but mostly a nice guy. He really seems to have a lot of faith in Yumido, Shinso said, with a raised eyebrow. It'd be nice to have a teacher that wanted me in the hero course so bad. When the sports festival comes, you'll have the hero course teachers falling all over themselves to mentor you, Izuku promised, and was pleased when Shinso blushed but didn't look away. Eat up, green bean, Hatsume said, poking Izuku with a finger. Running out of time. Right, said Izuku and refocused on his lunch. He couldn't let anything distract him today. The stadium was big. Izuku had watched the UA sports festivals alongside the rest of the world since he was a child, so he'd thought he'd had a pretty good idea of the size of the facility they were held in. He was so far off the mark he might as well have been picturing a scale model rather than the actual place. As he stood beneath the archway looking out over the field, at the ring drawn on the ground where the fight would take place, he felt smaller than he could ever remember feeling. He himself was hidden in shadows, but as he peered out he could see the members of Class 1A seated in the front rows of the stands. Way up above was the announcer box where present Mike would be giving his commentary. It was all sickeningly real and terrifyingly huge. From Class 1A, the explosive powerhouse that dominated the entrance exam, "It's Katsuki Bakugo," shouted Mike, his voice echoing throughout the stadium. Izuku doubted he even needed a microphone. Kaken walked out of an archway on the other side of the field, in gym clothes like Izuku and wearing an impatient scowl. There was a smattering of polite applause from the gathered Class 1A, most loudly from Ida and Kirishima. And from Class 1C, Mike went on, sounding just as excited about one combatant as another to a degree Izuku found almost frighteningly precise. The clever analyst who just keeps exceeding our expectations, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku walked out of the archway. The sunlight was dazzling in his eyes as it fell suddenly across his face, but its light was warming after the chill of the shadows. Class 1A was cheering wildly now, some of them standing up in their seats, whistles and chanting of his name reaching his ears as he walked. He blinked rapidly to let his eyes adjust, and stopped when he reached the edge of the circle, just as Kaken had. The rules are real simple, folks. Mike called down the audience. It's a one-on-one, no support items, quirks only hand-to-hand fight. Anything goes, just stay in the circle, and the first person to cross the line loses. Now, combatants enter the circle. Kaken stepped confidently forward, and Izuku mirrored him. They both walked until about half the length of the circle was between them, then stopped. Kaken's stance was relaxed, but Izuku knew how fast that could change, so he planted his feet. On the count of 3, Mike shouted. 3, 2, 1, fight. Kaken didn't waste time. He darted forward, eyes blazing maniacally and a grin splitting his face wide. He was clearly looking forward to beating the hell out of Izuku, to showing the others how useless he was, just like he had nearly every day in middle school. Today was not every day in middle school. As a big right hook swung toward him, Izuku shifted slightly, catching the arm mid-swing and using it to flip Kaken over and throw him to the ground on his back. Kaken gave loud grunt on impact, eyes closed against the hit. All too soon they popped open, however, and as Izuku backed up toward the center of the ring, Kaken quickly rolled into a crouch. He was glaring at Izuku, teeth bared. A bold opening from Bakugo, but it's no match for the skill on display by Midoriya. Came Mick's voice booming over the pitch, summoning a round of cheers from the crowd. What the hell, you demon nerd? Kaken growled, scrambling to get to his feet once more. You always open with a big right hook, Kaken, Izuku said, putting up his hands in front of himself, balled into fists and prepared to strike. It's the same every time. I studied all those heroes for so long, and that included you. I know how you fight. He darted forward, drawing his fist back as he went. And I know how to beat you. Kaken growled again, lips pulled back in a snarl, and this time he didn't waste time with a punch or a block. He put out a hand in front of himself and released an explosion, right into Izuku's face. Or rather, where Izuku's face would have been, if he hadn't dropped to the ground just in time, using his forward momentum to swing his leg around and catch Kaken in the ankles. Another clever piece of misdirection by Midoriya. Mike called as Kaken went down, an aborted swear on his lips that was completely inaudible to anyone but Izuku. It's clear to see who's fighting smart in this match. Kaken hit the ground hard, once again on his back. He tried to right himself, but Izuku was already down on his level, so he seized one of Kaken's legs and threw it up and over the rest of his body. Kaken went into an inelegant roll, and as Izuku sprang back to his feet, he was left in a jumbled heap, significantly closer to the edge of the ring than he had been before. Kick his butt. Shinso called from the stands, and Hatsume gave a wordless cheer in agreement. Izuku advanced again, intent on using a kick next, but before he could reach his opponent, suddenly Kaken managed to get his hands pointed at the ground. He let off a blast from each palm, propelling himself up and towards Izuku, resulting in an artless but efficient tackle that hit Izuku square in the stomach. Direct hit by Bakugo. Mike cried boisterously. That explosion quirk is just so versatile. They went down together, scrabbling in the dirt, the sounds of mixed commentary and Class 1A screaming in alarm a backdrop to their scuffle. Kaken was, at the end of the day, physically bigger and stronger, and after a moment of this he managed to pin Izuku beneath him by both wrists. Learned a few new tricks since I last put you in your place, Kaken hissed, grinning savagely down at Izuku. Kaken's palms grew hot, his lighting mechanism smoking as it seared Izuku's skin, and he knew he'd have to break the hold fast. With all the leverage he kneed Kaken in the stomach, making him cough and disrupting his balance somewhat. Izuku used this to roll them over until he was the one crouching over Kaken with his knee still in the other boy's stomach. In his surprise, Kaken loosened his grip, and Izuku was able to JRK his wrists free. "Me too, Kaken," Izuku replied. "You might pin him for a minute, but Midoriya's not giving up," Mike called as Izuku caught his breath. Kaken gave a wordless noise of frustration and put a hand directly against Izuku's chest. With a split second to react, Izuku threw himself back, but he wasn't fast enough to completely avoid the blast. He landed on his back, breath punched out of him, chest and wrists smarting from the burns. But before Kaken could advance, he forced himself into a roll and popped back to his feet. Kaken was still between him and the nearest line. "Watch out for those close-range explosions," Mike said theatrically as Kaken leaped up directly off his back, moving out with his feet, undulating his body through the air so that he landed upright. "Bakugo might just be too hot to handle. You honestly think you can beat me?" Kaken shouted, loud enough for the spectators to hear. "I've got the best quirk there is for hero work. You're just a quirkless loser who will never amount to anything." He ran forward, throwing a blast at Izuku, but again Izuku dodged and aimed a kick at Kaken's stomach. For a moment Kaken seemed to take it hard, curling in on himself around the hit, but then he grabbed Izuku's leg and used it to wrench him off balance. Izuku went down, hard on his back, and quickly had to roll out of the way as Kaken brought down an exploding hit right where his head had been a moment before. "Looks like Bakugo's learned the art of misdirection," Mike speculated as Izuku came to rest on his back again. "That was a move straight out of Midoriya's playbook. You think the fact that you managed to trick these extras into supporting you means anything?" Kaken went on, kicking at Izuku's legs as he tried to get back to his feet, stopping him from getting up and forcing him to scuffle back, closer to the line. With one last desperate kick, Izuku managed to catch Kaken in the knee, causing him to stumble slightly and giving Izuku time to right himself. He got back to his feet, and quickly scrambled to put distance between himself and Kaken, backing up toward the center. "Midoriya's still not giving up though, he's not done yet folks," Mike shouted, and Izuku nearly thought he heard a note of encouragement in it. That was how he chose to take it, anyway. "You're just a worthless, pathetic Deku," shouted Kaken, and ran at Izuku with hand outstretched. Izuku made to grab Kaken again, but at the last second Kaken shifted, pulling his punch in a way Izuku had never seen him do. Before Izuku could decipher it, suddenly Kaken was leaping at him, using explosions to propel himself up and over the place where Izuku was standing. Izuku didn't have time to react, and the explosion that fired directly against his back sent him lurching forward, crying out in pain. Forcing his eyes open before he'd righted himself, he realized how close to the line he was. If he kept stepping forward enough to regain his footing, he would be out of bounds. Planting his feet to stop, Izuku fell forward, bracing himself with his hands so he didn't break his face. He was barely inside the line. "What an incredible move!" Mike screamed as Izuku flipped onto his back, the dirt and grit of the pitch digging painfully into the fresh burns. "The power, the control, the showmanship. And now I'm going to show them how weak you really are," Kaken concluded, diving forward to bring an explosion directly down on Izuku. There was a moment, then, of crystal clarity. For a split second the pitch faded, and in Izuku's mind's eye a whole scene played out in less time than it would take to blink. He was lying on the training mat in the gym, with Shinso standing over him. Everyone else had gone, and it was just the two of them. "He's not going to content himself with beating you," Shinso said in his memory. "He's going to want to hurt you as badly as he can with all the opportunity he has. Even if you're down, he's going to attack. And that's how you're going to get him." As Kaken committed to his attack, angling his body into the dive and pressing off the ground with one last powerful leap, Izuku brought his legs up against his chest. He bent his knees, pointing the soles of his feet out and upward, vaguely in the direction Kaken was coming from. He didn't kick out right away though. He waited until Kaken was above him, until the explosions were already fiery blossoms emanating from his palms. Then he kicked out with both feet, propelling Kaken not back, but up and over him, extending his arc so he didn't come down on Izuku but instead went past him and continued on. The explosions rang out, the force of them causing Kaken to travel even farther, until he had sailed well over Izuku and nearly clear of the cloud of resultant smoke. Izuku rolled painfully into a crouch and waited for the smoke to clear. It took a few seconds, and in that time there was utter silence from the crowd. 1 heartbeat, then 2, then 3, and then the remnants of the explosion faded and Izuku could see Kaken again. He too had righted himself, and was looking back at Izuku with face pale, but set and angry, and he was plainly ready to attack immediately. Then something caught his attention. The line of paint on the ground. It was between them. "Izuku Midoriya wins," shrieked Mike, loud enough that it seemed to shake the stadium. "What?" screamed Kaken, staring at the line in disbelief. In an incredible final move, Midoriya used his opponent's own quirk against him to propel him out of the ring. Mike called, even though the uproar of cheering from the stands was already giving him a run for his money in enthusiasm if not volume. What a show! What a battle! What an incredible display of strength and skill! "You've got to be kidding me!" Kaken shouted, his face turned to the announcer box as Izuku got shakily to his feet. "He's just a pathetic little bug. There's no way he beat me. And yet here you are outside the ring," said Eraserhead's calm, even voice, and Izuku looked over to see him out on the pitch, walking towards them with leisurely, unhurried strides. "You lost, Bakugo. You'll be transferred to Class 1C, while Midoriya takes your spot in the hero course." "I'm not going to the Demon Gen Ed course," Kaken screamed, rounding on Eraser when the announcer box wouldn't respond to his ire. "Deku can't be a hero, he doesn't have a quirk. I'm the ideal hero." "Not from my perspective," Eraser said seriously. "From where I'm standing you're a bully who only cares about himself, more likely to make a jackboot thug than a hero." Kaken let out a wordless roar of rage, but he seemed to know he'd get nowhere by attacking Eraser. Instead he rounded on Izuku, palms popping with explosions and eyes full of burning rage. "You're dead, Deku," he shouted. "You're gonna wish you'd jumped off the roof when I told you to." Izuku dropped into a fighting stance, ready to defend against Kaken's next attack, but before either of them could move suddenly Kaken's explosions were fizzling out. A split second later, before he'd even had time to be confused, Eraserhead's capture weapon was wrapping around him, pinning his hands to his sides and dragging him across the pitch and up against the teacher's chest. "So it's true," Eraser growled, glaring down at Kaken with eyes blazing red. "You did tell him to kill himself in middle school." "So what?" Kaken grumbled, straining against the capture weapon. No one cared, the little punk deserved dash. No one deserves suicide baiting, Eraser cut him off sharply. "Your middle school might not have taken it seriously, but at UA we consider it a very serious matter. You are going to explain yourself to Principal Nezu, and when that meeting is over you will count yourself lucky if you end up in Gen Ed." Eraser's hair fell in his face and his capture weapon unraveled from around Kaken. Before Kaken could move though, Eraser was taking him by the arm and dragging him toward the archway that led off the pitch and out of the arena. Izuku made to go after them, hand outstretched, but before he could do or say anything suddenly arms were wrapping around his torso and lifting him off his feet. "Congratulations, Midoriya," came Ida's voice, both above him and rumbling through the chest pressed to his side. Izuku winced as the bone-crushing hug put pressure on the places where he was burned, but he managed not to make a noise of distress. "Ida?" Izuku asked instead, and was immediately set back his feet. He turned, to see Ida giving a formal bow. "I apologize for hugging you," he said, then straightened and began chopping his hand down through the air for emphasis. "I was merely overwhelmed by the moment. Your victory was very impressive, and extremely satisfying to watch." "Way to go, Midoriya," came Uraraka's voice from behind Ida, and Izuku peered around the taller boy to see that the stands were empty and all the spectators were streaming out onto the field. "Thanks," Izuku said numbly. He was surprised to realize he was shaking. Why was he shaking? "I couldn't have done it without all of you. You're too kind," Ida insisted, and Uraraka giggled. From there Izuku was swamped by the other students. Kirishima had to ruffle his hair. Hagakure had to give him a big hug. Yaoyorozu shook his hand, and made a whispered apology that she hadn't been there to train with him. Izuku shook his head to indicate that he didn't blame her at all, and she gave him a radiant smile. Hatsume, like Ida, lifted him off his feet with her hug. She was surprisingly strong, but then again Izuku figured she spent all day lugging around heavy machinery, so it wasn't all that surprising. Shinso was curiously at the back of the group, but Izuku saw him coming from the direction in which Eraser and Kaken had disappeared, so most likely Shinso had merely gone to check on them. He gave Izuku a big hug too, tucking Izuku's head beneath his chin and folding him into his embrace. "You did it, Mido," Shinso said into Izuku's hair. "I did," Izuku said, and just like that, for the first time, it was true. He'd done it. He'd beaten Kaken. He was in the hero course. He was going to be a hero. Izuku did, in the end, cry. He got through being congratulated by all his friends and then by most of the teachers. Eraserhead was absent from the celebrations, but Midnight assured him that his new homeroom teacher was glad he'd won. She made a slightly off-color joke, and then another when Izuku jolted in surprise, but then she gave him her sincere congratulations. Eventually he was whisked up to Recovery Girl's office, and she congratulated him too before kissing his cheek and healing the burns on his chest and back. "I know this was an important fight for you," she said as she bandaged up what remained of the burns, mostly healed but still a little tender, "so I won't scold you this time, but this is a dangerous line of work you're getting into, so try and be a little more careful in future." "Yes, ma'am," Izuku promised, nodding vigorously. "I will." "Good," she said, tying off the last bandage. "Give those the weekend to heal before you return to training, but you should be good to go by Monday." "Thank you," Izuku said, accepting a candy from her Kamui Woods dispenser. As Izuku popped the candy into his mouth and crunched it, a slight knock came from the direction of the door. Izuku and Recovery Girl both looked over to see present Mike standing in the doorway. "Hey there, listeners," he said boisterously, forgoing a pose this time to lean casually against the doorframe. "Don't mean to interrupt, but if I could have a minute with Midoriya, that'd be rockin'." "Of course, dear," said Recovery Girl, hopping down off her stool and ambling over to the door. "Just be careful of those bandages now." Mike stepped into the infirmary, smiling his trademark smile at Recovery Girl as her cane tapped across the floor. He watched her go out in the hall, then shut the door with a sharp snap behind herself. Izuku turned to Mike once the door was closed, expecting dramatic congratulations, but as soon as they were alone, Mike rounded on Izuku with a wholly different smile than his usual one. Rather than practiced and perfect, it was wobbly and unsure, his lips trembling as the corners of his eyes crinkled behind his shades. "Sensei?" Izuku asked, a little worried at this unusual look. Then Mike sniffed, and Izuku realized he was holding back tears. "You did so good," Mike said, and his voice was soft but shaking with emotion. Listener, you did so good and dash." Mike cut himself off with a choked sound, launching himself across the room to take Izuku's head in his hands and press it to his chest. With Mick's fingers in his hair, Izuku grasped the front of his teacher's shirt, face buried in the fabric. He could feel Mike curling around him, as though trying to envelope him in warmth. "Thank you," Izuku said quietly. He knew Mike had stopped talking and come to hug him because he was finally crying. "You were amazing," Mike whispered. "You were a star out there. You were everything I knew you could be." "I couldn't let everyone down," Izuku shook his head, rubbing his eyes against Mick's chest. "I couldn't let you down. Everyone's worked so hard to help me, and I was just so grateful that I just had to win. I had to." "You won for all of us," Mike agreed. "You won for you, but it means so much to so many people. You have no idea, listener. You're going to be great." Izuku nodded, but couldn't say any more. His throat felt tight and raw, like he'd been crying for hours. Mick's fingers continued to comb through his hair, and gentle shushing noises were coming from above him, but other than that Mike was quiet. He stood there, letting Izuku cry, for as long as he needed. After a few minutes of this, Izuku sniffled purposefully and unwound his fingers from the front of Mick's shirt. Mike disentangled his hands from Izuku's hair, and when he stepped back, Izuku caught him wiping at one eye with his finger before letting his shades fall back into place. He smiled down at Izuku, A genuine, artless smile that made Izuku feel warm inside. "Welcome to the hero course, lil listener," Mike said happily. "You got a lot to learn, but I know you'll do great." "I'll do my best," Izuku promised, nodding seriously. "I couldn't ask for better teachers." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything suddenly there came a loud knock at the door. Both of them jolted and looked around. That did not sound like a knock that had come from the tiny recovery girl. "Yes?" Mike called curiously. The door slid open, and Izuku's heart clenched to see All Might standing on the other. "So, Yamada," he boomed, the light glinting off his perfect teeth as he smiled. "I heard I might find you here. Would it be all right if I had a moment with young Midoriya?" Mike glanced at Izuku as though asking for permission. Izuku didn't know what expression he was wearing, but it made Mike frown in concern. Very deliberately Izuku hitched a smile in place. He had known, of course, that All Might was the heroics teacher for the first years. He knew this conversation was coming. "It's all right," he said, nodding slightly. "I know what this is about." Mike glanced at All Might distrustfully for a second, then fixed his own present Mike's smile back in place and gave a casual finger gun. "No probs," he said, and walked over to the door. All Might stepped inside to give him room to step out, and Mike threw one last glance at Izuku once he was out in the hall. Izuku gave him a reassuring smile, and he shut the door. Now it was All Might's turn to strike a pose. "Young man," he said loudly, "I'm sure you're wondering why I needed to talk to you. You're going to tell me I can't be a hero without a quirk," Izuku said dully. In response to this, All Might gave a loud, hacking cough, blood spraying from his mouth as his body seemed to deflate until he was standing before Izuku as a tall, skinny skeleton of a man. He coughed a few more times, softer and shorter, then wiped at his mouth with his hand. "No," he said at last, his voice lower and rougher as though from disuse, like this form and his other one were two different people. "Actually, I came to tell you quite the opposite." Izuku stared at him, nonplussed. "What?" All Might cleared his throat, then stood a little straighter and stared at Izuku with his dark, sunken eyes. "Young man," he began purposefully, "you've seen me in this form and you know my secret. Or rather, you know part of my secret. On the day we met you caught me at a bad time. I was out of energy to maintain my All Might form and I was experiencing a moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness?" Izuku repeated. He couldn't fathom where All Might was going with this. All Might hung his head. "I was losing faith in myself," he said, "and with it I was losing faith in the future. I'd forgotten the things that made me want to be a hero, and the things that made it possible for me to achieve that dream. I spoke harshly to you, because I was too busy being a grouchy old man to be a hero. You didn't deserve that." "It's all right," Izuku said automatically. "You don't need to apologize to me. If you're not going to tell me to reject the transfer to the hero course, I would never tell you a thing like that." All Might insisted, putting up both hands as though to ward off the very idea. "The courage you displayed on that day, when you dove into the incident on the street, inspired me to act as well. If you hadn't acted a timid, quirkless boy like you, I wouldn't have been able to help. You reminded me of why I became a hero and, more than that, you restored my faith in heroes." Izuku stared at him, but didn't say anything. He couldn't think of a single thing to say. How could he have done all that? He'd only acted without thinking, diving headlong into a dangerous situation with no plan. How could he have restored All Might's faith in heroes? All Might took a deep breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, the point I am meanderingly trying to make is that I was wrong. Young man, you can be a hero, and I want to help you. I want to give you my quirk." Izuku blinked at him. I think I misheard you," he said after a moment of silence. "It sounded like you said dash. My quirk," All Might cut him off, "is very special. It is the only quirk in the world, to my knowledge, that can be passed from person to person. Since the dawn of quirks it has passed from one wielder to another, one hero to another, picking up power as it goes. The physical abilities of all the previous wielders combine into the strength, speed and power that I used to become a hero. This is the power known as One for All." "One for All," Izuku echoed in a daze. Everything seemed very far away right now. On the day we met I wasn't sure, All Might said. I had a plan to find a successor, someone to pass one for all on to now that my body is almost ready to give out. I was going to use my teaching position to find a hero student who was worthy. I've made my choice, and the hero student I've selected is you. Me? Izuku sputtered, eyes wide. Yes, you, All Might confirmed. Then he held out a hand. Will you accept my decision, and allow me to pass on the power of one for all to you? Izuku looked at All Might's hand. His mind was reeling to fit everything he'd just learned into his previous view of the world. His imagination whirred to fit having a quirk into his vision of the future. Somehow, none of it seemed to work. He wrestled with it, trying to make the pieces click into place, but somehow he just couldn't make it come together. Something he couldn't identify kept the conclusions tantalizingly out of reach. A hero needs to remember that they have influence over others with what they say and how they act, Mike had said. They look up to me because I'm a hero, so I've got to set a good example for them. I heard you don't have a quirk, Fujioka had told him. Well, neither does my little sister. I just thought if you win, well, it'd really be something to tell her, you know? I'm sorry, Izuku, his mother had sobbed. I wish things were different. No, he said. For a moment there was silence. All Might stared at him, mouth open, blinking in confusion. Then suddenly another hacking cough racked his body, and he withdrew his hand and held it over his mouth to avoid spitting blood all over Izuku. No! All Might repeated, once he had regained control of himself. No, Izuku said again, stronger this time, louder and more sure. Thank you for the kind offer, I appreciate your faith in me. Very much, but I can't accept you quirk. Why not? All Might demanded. I promise this isn't a joke, I'm dead serious about Dash. I believe you, Izuku assured him hurriedly. Really I do, but I need to become a hero without a quirk. All Might paused a moment as though to digest this piece of information. You're serious, he realized. You're really going to say no to the chance of a lifetime. I'm sorry, Izuku said sheepishly, but if today proved anything, it's that I can be a hero without a quirk. And if I can do that, if that's at all possible, I think it's something I need to do. There are plenty of worthy candidates to be your successor, and I'm sure the one you choose will be amazing. But there's only one quirkless kid who's made it into the hero course as he is. It'll be hard, All Might warned. Being a hero even with a quirk is no joke. Without one, you'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else. 10 times as hard, Izuku agreed. But, someday soon, some little kid is going to be diagnosed quirkless. He's going to come home from the worst doctor visit of his life, the one that crushes his dreams and forever singles him out as weak and worthless, and he's going to go to the computer and search for information on famous quirkless people. If that search can pull up a hero, even just one, do you know what it will mean to him? What it would have meant to me? All Might looked at him a few moments longer. Izuku wondered if he could understand, having been so powerful for so long. Before he had gotten one for all, what had his life been like? Did he remember what it was like to be helpless? Eventually, All Might nodded. I do, he said. Izuku gave him a grateful smile, and All Might slapped a hand over his face. Oh man, he said exasperatedly, I really thought I'd finished my search. Now I have to start all over again. Maybe Nezu has a recommendation? Izuku consoled, trying not to feel guilty. His recommendation was you. All Might laughed. Everyone I know recommended you. You were perfect. Not that perfect, Izuku smiled shyly. All Might gave him a wide grin, and though it seemed to strain his skeletal face, it lit up his hooded eyes and made them sparkle. Perfect just as you are, he said and winked. Are you really going to just let him stay? Shoyuta asked Nezu, once the office door had closed behind Bakugo. Nezu motioned for Shoyuta to sit down. It would defeat the purpose of today if I didn't, he said as Shoyuta came around the desk and collapsed into the chair opposite him. And today did go so very well, it would be a shame to waste all that effort. We didn't have any proof that Bakugo had suicide-baited Midoriya before now, Shoyuta pointed out, but the cameras at the stadium recorded him admitting it. Even if you were willing to let him stay in the hero course if he won before dash. Don't be silly, Nezu said with an easy smile. I was always going to expel Bakugo if he won. Shoyuta blinked at him. What? The kettle whistled, and Nezu paused their conversation in order to slowly prepare himself a cup of tea. This took a few minutes, during which total silence reigned. Shoyuta waited patiently as he settled himself in his chair and took a sip, then gave an audible sigh. There was no point rushing Nezu with a cup of tea. Finally Nezu turned his smile back on Shoyuta. I had every intention of expelling Bakugo at his next infraction, Nezu repeated. All the evidence we have suggests that my early impressions of him were correct. His personality and temperament simply aren't suited to being a hero. I couldn't put the weight of Yue's reputation behind a candidate so volatile. It wouldn't be right, and it wouldn't be smart. And Midoriya? Shoyuta prompted. Would you have left him in Gen Ed? Of course not. Nezu's voice was nearly a laugh. I would have waited until the sports festival, and depending on his performance there I would have transferred him to either the support course or the hero course as befitted the circumstances. It wouldn't do to simply waste a mind like his. Then why bother with the match at all? Shoyuta wondered. Why make such a big deal out of making them fight, if the outcome was going to be the same either way? Nezu took a long sip of his tea. My instincts regarding Midoriya were that his main issue was confidence. Tell me, how do you think his confidence is doing after today? Much better, Shoyuta admitted. That I understand, but what about Bakugo? You still intend to honor the deal and transfer him to Gen Ed. A very merciful solution, wouldn't you agree? Nezu said pointedly. By expelling him for behavioral misconduct, rather than inability to meet course expectations, we would be demonstrating that our admittance parameters are flawed enough to allow such an unruly student to enter school in the first place. Nezu wrinkled his nose a little bit, and Shoyuta could appreciate what it cost him to admit that, even if he was only talking about the school's reputation rather than the reality. As such, expelling him would merely be damage control, Nezu went on, a way to avoid the situation getting any worse. Transferring him to the general education course, by contrast, looks significantly less judgmental. It seems less like protecting the school and more like protecting him. An elegant solution, Shoyuta agreed, even if it doesn't seem quite fair. Consider also what might happen to Bakugo after his expulsion, Nezu countered. A boy with such a strong quirk and so many emotional problems, denied the one thing he wants above all else? How easy do you think it would be for him to fall in with a bad crowd? So putting him in Gen Ed gives the illusion of mercy, while also keeping him on a short leash, Shoyuta concluded. You do have a way of tying things up neatly. I like to think so, Nezu sighed into his tea. There's just one more thing I'd like to know though, Shoyuta said, earning himself a raised eyebrow as Nezu took another sip. Why are you telling me this, as opposed to Hizashi? Nezu smiled over the rim of his cup. For the same reason I'm telling you now as opposed to a week and a half ago, he said pleasantly. I had hoped that the preparations for Midoriya's match might sponsor a sense of community. In particular, I thought Yamada might become a little more attached to Midoriya, having seen him work so hard, and I thought that would be good for both of them. Shoyuta nodded. He knew perfectly well what Nezu meant. He had thought the placing Midoriya in a perilous situation would spark Hizashi's heroic instincts, make him more protective of the boy. Shoyuta had to admit, it had worked. And not only on Hizashi. I'm in awe of your wisdom, he said, only partially sarcastically. Are you dissatisfied? Nezu asked, with an air of someone who already knew the answer to their question. Shoyuta shook his head. No, I'm not.